Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 true unexplained events reported by cemetery workers, Arvolor 3, we return to the quiet edges of the world, where the hum of the living fades, and only the wind moves through the graves. These are the confessions of those who tend the dead, caretakers who have seen candles flicker in sealed mausoleums, heard their names whispered from empty plots, and felt unseen hands brush past them in the dark. Every account you're about to hear comes from those who walk among the tombstones after midnight, people who have buried their fear along with the bodies, and yet still know, not everything buried stays silent. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers listen and disappear without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a cemetery in your town that truly unsettles you, type its name below. Because when the world sleeps and the soil settles, some things beneath it do not rest. Kill the lights. Silence the world, take a slow breath, and let us begin. The first thing I heard was the chain on the outer gate complaining in the wind, that metal scrape that carries farther when the air is wet. My breath fogged the small window over the sink, and the radio on my belt was hissing to itself like it always does when the weather turns. I had the kettle going because my hands don't like the damp anymore, and the smell of rust from the watch house stove made the tea taste wrong. By the fourth scrape of the chain, I was already up, already reaching for my maglite, already telling myself that it was just the padlock settling. I'm the night caretaker at St. Luke's Cemetery here in town, and this happened during my last week on the job. I stepped out into the drizzle and pulled the door tight so it wouldn't whine. The sodium lamps bleed a kind of apricot color over everything and turn the fog into a wall. I did the routine. Sweep the beam along the perimeter fence across the chapel's eaves, check the bell rope that hangs outside the east transept. It was moving a little, but the wind was moving everything a little, and the rope is old. The radio coughed and cleared. Klein to night watch. Her voice is always dry like paper. I keyed back that I was doing rounds. She didn't answer, which is typical. I started along the gravel, listening to the tick of my boots and the light tapping the names. Denny, Mallory, Green, Bishop, because when you're out there alone you end up reading everything. The first odd thing was small. The padlock on the service gate for the ground shed had the shackle through the second link, not the third. I always use the third. It's habit. I pulled it and it gave, clean as if someone had oiled it. Inside, everything was damp and tidy. Steel trimmer in its rack, Fisker's shovels on the hooks, the bag of lime open like a mouth. Someone had put the brass plot map weights back in the drawer upside down. I fixed it and wiped my hand on my jacket. When I stepped out again, the bell rope by the chapel nudged itself once against the stone, a friendly touch. I told myself it was the wind finding one sure angle. We keep a ledger on the desk by the west window, and we log anything worth writing down. You could go back 20 years on that desk and read every dead tree that has fallen across a path, every visitor who refused to leave, every time Eddie left the side gate open. Eddie hums when he works, little brass band tunes under his breath, and he taps his thumb against his pocket when he's thinking. He'd been on day shift that week clearing branches. When I looked at the ledger before I went out, I noticed a burial entry for Ruth A. Mallory with a date that hasn't happened yet, 2 days ahead. I figured Klein had filled it in early like she does, but usually she leaves the date blank. I boxed it with my pen to ask later. I'm not superstitious. I just like the paperwork to match the ground. The radio sizzled as I moved past the mausoleum path. It doesn't have a formal name. We call it the family house because the same set has kept their bones in it since the 1890s. Granite steps lead up to a narrow portico, and the door is iron with a pattern that leaves your palm cold if you touch it. There's a basement, technically, more like a crawl space under the steps with a little hatch that's been painted shut forever. We use the steps as a place to sit when the summer grounds crew eats lunch, which nobody tells the families about. When I got there that night, I heard something soft under the scraping gate noise and the drizzle on the U's. It was a tone more than a sound, like a refrigeration unit far away. It came from the direction of the family house, low and constant. I stood on the path and held my breath, and the radio went quiet for once, and there it was, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I don't pretend I heard it long. The wind gusted and the leaves clapped together, and I lost it, and then I was moving again, Because you move when you're alone at night, you keep a pattern. At the outer gate, the chain was lying against the post, not pulled tight, and the padlock had been turned so the keyhole faced down. That's nothing. That's weather. I tightened the chain and put the lock back and noted the wet grit on my hands. The motorcade road had new tire tracks from the afternoon's funeral, and the drizzle made the oil rainbows turn slow. A light in the chapel popped and came back. The kind of flicker that makes you think you saw someone move inside when it's actually your eyes adjusting. Luis from grounds was finishing late in the shed when I came back that way for my second pass. He leaves me his leftover coffee sometimes in a chipped mug with a hummingbird on it. He flicked his lighter without lighting anything, just that tapping motion on the wheel. A nervous habit. "You got your hood up?" He called because he hates the rain worse than I do. I told him about the chain and the rope and the map weights. He shrugged and said, "Wind's got a long reach." I asked whether he'd run the trimmer in the old section. He said yes and tapped the lighter without thinking and started humming something under his breath as he coiled an extension cord. "You hear the refrigerator down there?" He said quick like he wanted to make a joke. I said I didn't know what he meant. He paused and his tap slowed. "Forget it." By midnight, the drizzle had turned to a mist, the kind of wet that finds the seam at your collar. My jacket was tired of it. I was tired of it. The ledger page made a soft whisper when I turned it and wrote the basics. One of the trouble lamps in the watch house kept dying, so I switched to the mag light and clipped it under the shelf with a binder clip. I boiled the kettle again and the water tasted like the inside of a pipe. When I went to check the outer road, the gate was locked, but the brass key we keep on the wall didn't fit it. That was new. The padlock was ours. The key was ours. It had a ding near the bow that I know because it fits my thumbnail. It refused the lock like it didn't recognize it. I tried the spare, same thing. I wrote that down. The second odd thing was the soil in lot C4. It had been leveled after the afternoon service, and yet it held water like a poorly sealed sink. The weather couldn't have done it in that hour. I pressed my boot and watched the water shiver around it, then seep back flat. The name on the new headstone was Ruth A. Mallory, and the letters were clean, still chalk dust in the grooves. The date was the same as the ledger, the one that hadn't arrived yet. I touched the top of the stone because I didn't believe my eyes and felt a cold that went inside the bone. Behind me, somewhere near the family house path, a small bell rang once, a sound like a teaspoon against a glass. I turned and saw the chapel rope sway once, then tilt back to rest on the stone. The wind had died. I checked the rope. No one there. The radio coughed into a word that wasn't a word and left me with the hiss. I called Klein. She doesn't like calls after midnight unless something is broken or bleeding. But I logged the chain, the rope, the gate key, the water at C4, and the new stone. She listened and sniffed like she gets when she wipes her glasses. 2 quick pats, 1 long drag. "Double-check the date in the morning," she said. "You've been on nights too long, and this weather makes everyone see things." "I can read a number," I said, "maybe too tight." She let it go. "Do not open anything," she said. "You remember when Eddie tried to pry up a cover on his own? We spent half a day stomping the ground flat again. Don't make me call him out of bed." I promised her I would not open anything. When we hung up, the radio repeated a single word in the static that sounded like open, then cleared. I made myself take the longer path across the old section, the one with the slate and the lamb carvings, because if you start avoiding parts of your route, you shouldn't be on nights. A lantern on the chapel steps wouldn't stay lit, which isn't a ghost, it's damp. I got it to catch and set it on the iron rail to burn off the moisture. The maglite beam stuttered twice and then steadied. On the west wall of the chapel, someone had chalked a circle around the seam of the small maintenance door. It's always locked. We never use it. The brass key on my ring that fits the old tool cupboard went in halfway and stopped. Wrong warding. I wrote that down. When I straightened, I caught the same low tone from before. Not loud, just patient, coming through the stone like a refrigerator in a far room. It was again from the family house, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. On my third pass of the shed, I found the duplicate key hook empty. Luis had gone home. His hummingbird mug was turned upside down to drain. The air inside smelled like cut cord and solvent and old raincoats. I checked the inventory clipboard out of spite and saw that someone had signed out a shovel between my second and third passes. It was the Fiskars with the serrated edge, and the signature line just had initials, RM. No one on staff with those. My radio crackled a laugh of static that sounded like breath. I put the clipboard under my arm and followed the gravel to Lot C4. I laid the clipboard on the wet grass and stood with the beam low. There were boot prints, not mine, not heavy, leading in a careful line from the gravel to the foot of Ruth Mallory. The soil had that same slow water. I crouched and pressed my hand and felt a vibration I told myself was the freeway a mile away. My hand came back slick with cold as if I'd pressed it to the inside of a refrigerator. I wiped it on the grass and my belly said, "Go back to the watch house," and my legs said, "Finish the pass." I did the pass. The lamps along the motorcade route buzzed like bees in a jar. The chapel windows held dull orange squares. From the family house, steady as a metronome I had learned to ignore, the quiet hum went on. Near to, the ledger page turned gritty with damp. The ink made thin cracks where I'd gone over the same letters. I saw the earlier entry for the burial confirmed by the funeral home. It was initialed by Klein and stamped. The time listed was 10 a.m. I remembered the service. The weather had been more forgiving then. Someone had put a note in the margin, "Bell rope replaced, frayed." That was from Eddie. He draws the E like a Z. He must have done it before he punched out. I walked to the chapel to look at his work because looking at work settles my head. The rope was new. You could tell by the feel. No polish from hands yet. It was white against the stone, and at the end the knot was stiff. The little clapper bell inside the porch looked clean. I stood under it, and the cold worked its way through my hood to the back of my neck. I heard a footstep behind me and turned my light toward it and saw nothing. Just that amber fog. 2 drops hit the brim of my cap close together. The mag light picked out a wet streak on the stone steps where someone had stood and dripped. I told myself it was the roof. The radio ticked. "Night," Klein said. I answered. She said, "Don't let the rain make you lonely." That was her way of saying, don't make something out of nothing. She didn't ask for any updates about gates or ropes or initials that didn't belong, and I didn't volunteer. We both hung up before the hiss started. At 3, the gate by the outer road was locked again, and this time the chain had an extra twist in it, like someone had wound it too far and let it spring back a fraction. The brass key still refused the padlock. I looked at the key close in the wash of the lamp and saw a smear at the base like glue or sap. I scraped at it with my nail and a thin thread came away like the skin on milk. I put it to my tongue without thinking. It tasted old and metallic. I spat and cursed myself. I set the key on the top rail and dried my hands on my jacket. The radio purred the first syllable of open and stopped, like it was choking on its own word. I picked up the key and clipped it back and told myself I was going to the family house because not going had become worse than going. The path is a ribbon through the older plots, where the stones lean as if they're listening. The family house steps were wet. The iron door had beads of water that lined up like careful handwriting. The portico smelled like wet coin. I pointed the beam at the hatch seam under the steps, and that was when my throat closed a little, and I had to breathe slow. There were pry marks there, fresh, paint lifted like scabs around the edge. On the riser of the 3rd step, someone had chalked the outline of a small keyhole that didn't exist. I turned, checked the path, checked the trees, checked the chapel light. When I faced the steps again, the hum rose to the edge of what I could feel in my teeth. It wasn't a machine. It was more like a voice that had forgotten how to shape words, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I had promised Klein I wouldn't open anything. I held my breath and listened for a reason to walk away. The drizzle gathered itself and ran. The lamps clicked in their housings. The bell rope stirred once as the air shifted. I crouched in the wet and put my hand on the 3rd riser. It was warmer than the others. My thumb found a nick in the stone like a tiny door jamb where a door shouldn't be. I slid the brass key from my belt because my hand needed to hold something that belonged to the world I knew. It glinted like old honey. I pressed it against the chalked keyhole because I expected the satisfaction of nonsense. Metal against flat stone. A click in my head that says, "This is foolish. Go back inside." Instead, the key clicked against something that gave. I froze. My breath made a small cloud and broke apart. I pressed again gently, the way you might press a book spine. The key seated itself a 1/4 inch into nothing. The humming deepened and smoothed like a man shifting his weight on a wooden chair. The 3rd step moved. Not enough to see it move. Enough to know in my hand that it had. My radio fell off my belt when I straightened and banged against the step. Hard enough to send pain up my arm, and the word and the static came out properly this time. "Open," It said, flat like it was reading from a list. I didn't open anything. I stepped back and picked up the radio and my mag light. The light shook because my hand was shaking, and it threw little commas of gloss along the wet stone. I heard another sound then, under the hum, small and stubborn like fingernails exploring wood. Not furious, curious, the kind of sound you hear when mice figure out a cupboard. I backed off the portico and felt the air go colder when I left, the way it does when you step out from under a heater. There were no footprints on the path I hadn't made. The drizzle made sure of that. My jacket slid against itself with a wet whisper. I put the brass key back on my ring because throwing it felt childish and keeping it felt like the right kind of adult thing. The thing that proves the world has hinges you can understand. Back at the watch house, I dried the radio with a towel and swore at myself for letting it get banged around. I sat with the ledger and wrote nothing for a minute because my handwriting would have betrayed the tremor in my hand. I poured tea I didn't want, and the kettle was angry at the little stove and the water tasted like coins. When I finally put pen to paper, my breath steadied on the upstrokes. I wrote 3:17 a.m., unidentified vibration near mausoleum steps. Possible loose stone. Investigate with daylight. The rain took a breath and came harder for 5 minutes, then gentled. When I looked up, the trouble lamp above the desk had gone out again. I clicked the mag light to life and set it so the beam made a clean wedge on the ledger. The radio purred a word I refused to parse, like a name said through a wall. I told myself it said open because at least that was stupid in a way I recognized. The climax, I guess, began when I heard digging. It was nothing nice like a shovel ringing. It was a scooping sound, wet and steady, too measured for any animal. I caught the Fiskars missing on the inventory like a knot catching a nail in my rib cage, and was out the door with the mag light in one hand, the radio in the other, my hood up, the brass key biting my hip. The fog had thickened into a private world around the watch house. My breath showed in pieces. I took the path past the chapel and the bell rope was still. The lantern had nursed itself to death. The motorcade lamps hummed like power lines, and the sound of wet earth being moved went on somewhere near C4. I kept my light low out of habit. Less reflection, better contrast. The beam found water hanging off a row of boxwood hedges in a line like little glass bells. I stepped around them and put my boot in mud up to the laces. My socks got cold in 1 second. The sound of scooping stopped. I listened and heard water finding its angle. The drizzle here felt heavier, as if the air pooled. I drew the beam across the last stones and found the raw stripe of soil at Ruth Mallory's plot. The top had been peeled back in a rectangle you could set a suitcase in. The Fiskars lay across the grass, serrated edge wet with nothing but rain. No one there. I tilted the shovel with my boot. The mud had a square imprint in it like a book pressed flat. I crouched and saw the thing I still don't know how to write clearly. The soil at the center of the rectangle moved. It didn't cave. It didn't collapse. It flexed like skin over a muscle, once small, then smoothed, soft press from below. I put my hand quick to the dirt and felt through the cold a thrum that matched nothing I could attach to pipes or trains. My hand came away tingling. I reached for the radio. "Klein," I said, and my voice sounded calmer than my bones. "You're going to tell me you're opening something," she said, half asleep, half braced like she always is. "I'm not," I said. "I think someone else is." The radio clicked and popped, and in the blur of sound I got the shape of a word that was my name and not my name. Klein said, "What?" And I said, "I need you to wake Eddie and tell him to bring the plot map because I think we have a misalignment." That word, misalignment, is a comfort. It makes nightmares into drafting errors. Klein said she would call, and then she said, "Don't step back." That's something she says when she thinks the ground is soft. "I'm fine," I said, and I wasn't. My socks were cold and the rain was working down my sleeves. The lamps along the route guttered once and steadied, and the wet trees made a soft applause and then hushed. I picked up the Fiskars because leaving it there felt like evidence of something I didn't want to see again. The handle had some give under my grip where the varnish was failing. The serrations were clean. No clay clung between the teeth. The dirt on the ground, the rectangle, felt like it had been peeled up and set down and peeled up again.
"I checked the grave marker because you checked the thing you can name."
Ruth A. Mallory, same dates, same clean cut. The letters looked sharper than they had 2 hours before. I heard humming then, not from the family house, but from under my boots, mild and insistent, and it pushed me to move because standing still suddenly felt like waiting to be counted. I went to the path and kept my light pointed at the gravel. The rain became thread-like. My breath made short ghosts. I passed the chapel and the bell clapper moved a hair. Not from wind, but from a tremor that got into the stone. The little movement put itself into my teeth. When I reached the family house again, the hum knew me. That's the only way I can say it without telling a lie. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, steady as a held note. And the third riser gave the tiniest acknowledgement under my palm when I set it there. Like a patient that flexes a muscle to show you where it hurts. I told myself I wouldn't put the key in. I told myself I would stand, listen, and then walk back for paperwork and people. I took the radio from my belt and the water made my fingers squeak against the plastic. "Eddie's on his way," Klein said. "Don't touch anything." A light out by the outer road flickered and the chain sighed against the gate. I remembered the ledger initials. RM and I remembered the initials on the shovel sheet, and I remembered the box on the ledger page I'd made around the date, and I realized the letters might be for more than the shovel. I tapped the third step with my knuckle because my hand had to do something. It sounded not hollow and not solid like wood under a rug. The key slid out of my ring easier than it should have. I held it like a carpenter holds a nail between finger and thumb. My shoulder ached from keeping it tight against my body because the cold had set in. My breath rose and fell in two little plumes. I put the key against the chalk outline and the tip found that same impossible give. I didn't turn it. I swear I didn't. The movement came from the other side. The key rotated a quarter turn under my fingers like a magnet trying to remember its orientation, and the riser eased a fraction, and the hum under my bones shifted to a deeper register, not louder, just closer. And in the corner of my eye, the chapel rope twitched with the patience of something, timing a careful descent. I don't know how long I knelt there with my hand on that key and told myself not to move. The rain whispered above me. Somewhere back by the watch house, the kettle clicked as the heat under it died. My socks were cold enough to make my ankles ache. The radio sighed and cleared and gave me a burst of numeric chatter from some other service that meant nothing. When I let the key go, it stayed in the stone a second longer than it should have, like sap clinging, then fell into my palm. The step stayed where it had moved to, half the thickness of a coin forward, nothing anyone would notice with their eyes. I stood and every tendon in my legs told me they were happier for it. Eddie came up the path with his hood down like an idiot, hair full of wet leaves, humming the first few bars of something and stopping when he saw me. He wiped his glasses with his shirt, smearing the fog around. "Klein said misalignment?" he asked. Not quiet, because he doesn't do quiet. I nodded toward C4 and said, "Rectangular disturbance, no collapse. Fiskars on site. Check the map." He pulled the rolled plot map from under his jacket like a magician and set the brass weights at the corners out of habit. They made a tidy sound against the wet stone of the portico. As soon as he set them down, the humming seemed to ease, or maybe I told myself it did because I wanted something in the world to respond to a rule. "Ruth Mallory's plot is where it should be," he said, breath puffing. "You feeling all right?" He has a way of pretending the second part of his question is casual. He taps his thumb against his pocket when he's worried. He tapped it now. We walked to C4 together and his boots made a slow clock in the mud. The rectangle was there, crisp and wrong in the way crisp is wrong when everything else is softened by rain. Eddie crouched and the knees of his pants darkened and he pushed 2 fingers into the soil, quick like he was checking a cake. He pulled back and blew on his fingertips and frowned. "Warm," he said, which is not especially a thing you want said over anyone's grave. He looked at the marker. "They did a nice job," he said, which is the thing he says when he's thinking hard. He tapped his thumb against his pocket. "You get movers tonight?" I said no. He shrugged, stood, wiped his hand on his jacket, then on mine without asking. His old habit. "Make your notes. We'll see what looks dumb in daylight." We turned back up the path and the family house sat polite and old in its fog, and the steps were just steps again. Eddie bent to pick up the brass weights he'd left on the portico. He hesitated and looked at me. "You hear that?" he asked. I said, "What?" He shook his head like he was clearing water out of his ears. "Thought I heard humming," he said, and laughed like he didn't. "That old freezer you keep in the shed," he said, pointing back vaguely. I didn't correct him. I watched him tuck the weights into his jacket, and I watched the way the third riser looked slightly wrong only because I now knew what right should be, and I did not say a word. Dawn makes everything honest. It came slow gray, editing the orange out of the lamps. The drizzle lightened and the fog sagged into the hollows. I signed the ledger with a hand that had calmed, wrote the dry facts, and walked the inside of the fence once more while the birds tried to act normal. Klein arrived in her old sedan, silver windshield wipers scolding the glass. She keeps a small cloth in her pocket to wipe her glasses and did it twice before she spoke. "You look like you've been standing in a cooler," she said. I handed her the notes and told her about the shovel and the initials and the rectangular peel. She said, "We'll fix the ground after sunup." She didn't ask about the mausoleum, and I didn't volunteer. She signed the bottom of the page with her neat block letters and left the ledger open to dry. By 8, the crew arrived and the cemetery had that normal weekday feel, trucks low in gear, voices respectful but not theatrical. I watched Luis coil a hose, tapping his lighter's wheel without thinking, his hummingbird mug steaming again on the shed step. He didn't look at me long. "You can tell when someone is going to decide your story is just a long night in wet socks." I put the brass key back on its hook inside the watch house, in the spot where it waits for shift change, and for a moment I thought about taking it home, which I'd never done in 22 years. Around 9, I went back out with Eddie to tamp the soft places in lot C4. He hummed something cheerful and out of tune and checked the grade with his boot. The rectangle had smudged into the rest of the ground like a bruise fading. We made the surface gentle and he said, "Better," and I agreed. The bell in the chapel stayed still even when the door slammed in a gust. The lamps clicked off one by one. For a minute I believed the night belonged only to the night, and that the day takes what it's owed. I believed it the way you can believe anything if you line up 3 reasonable tasks and complete them. I went back to the watch house to finish the paperwork because it felt like a door I could close. The ledger lay open where Klein had left it, my notes above hers. There was a new line under mine in a handwriting that mocked my own. Same angle, same way the T crosses low. It said 3:17 a.m., accessed lower maintenance for ventilation check. All secure. It was signed with my name. The timestamp was 6 hours earlier than I had arrived. In the hook board over the desk, the brass key hung where I'd put it. But now there was a second older twin beside it I had never seen, with a chalk smudge at the tip shaped like a small, impossible keyhole. Outside, the morning trucks moved away and the cemetery settled into that weekday quiet that carries more than it says. The family house sat where it always has. If I stood very still, I could hear the noise under everything else again. Lower now, patient as ever, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first sound that cut through the drizzle was the bell rope knocking the wood in the chapel tower. Like a slow heartbeat inside a wet coat, my mag light showed the frayed end swinging on its own. No wind, just that steady tap and the hiss of rain on slate. I was halfway between the watch house and the mausoleum when I heard the iron gate shiver at the road, the latch lifting as if a hand tested it. I stopped because you train yourself to stop first and think after. I'm the night caretaker at Murdoch Hill Cemetery in the South End, and this happened 2 weeks ago on my first full month of overnight shifts, filling for Amos while his wife had surgery. It was one of those nights the air tastes like pennies. The drizzle sat on the skin more than it fell, and the big sodium lamps along the main path made the fog glow the color of old nicotine. My breath hung in it. Amos had left me the ring of keys in the ledger with his square, careful printing. "Gate at 217, he said as he wiped his glasses on his sleeve for the 10th time. Not really joking, just mentioning it because everyone does. He taps his pocket twice when he's nervous. The new guard, Tariq, stood by the outer gate tapping his lighter against his knuckles. He wasn't supposed to be on the grounds, but our radios share a channel and he likes the company. "If it opens again, I'm calling it," he'd said earlier, trying for casual, but he kept glancing back at the road. There's a story about a girl at that iron gate. I never saw her, and I didn't think about her unless a visitor brought it up. What I did think about was the faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. The ledger is our anchor. I signed in at 22:03 with the cheap bic every shift uses, checked the maintenance list, and compared the burial schedule. It was all the names I know now, like I know the stones without looking. Devine, Raza, Moray, Harcourt in the family plot. I paged to the interment records to make sure tomorrow's grave was prepped, and my eye tripped. Arthur Kareem was recorded as Thursday, but that was yesterday, and the plot was still covered. I underlined it and made a note for Joyce in the office, who chews her pencil eraser down to brass. In the shed behind the watch house, the steel trimmer leaned in its spot, orange plastic clean because I'd wiped it earlier. The Fisker's shovel stood beside it. My Motorola squelched when I passed. Tariq muttered to someone about the girl again, and I told him to keep the road clear. My job is everything inside the fence. I keep my boots quiet on the flagstone, and I try not to look too long at any one stone after midnight. I checked the padlock on the iron gate from the inside. The lock was the ugly gray one that doesn't mind the weather, and it was sealed. The latch, though, sat a hair off its seat as if it had lifted and fallen back. Water pooled along the road, reflecting the lamps and broken coins. I walked the path back past the chapel. The rope had stopped, the knotted end still. That's when I noticed the lantern on the chapel's side table gutter go bright, then die to a weak ember. We keep it for funerals that want the old look. I trimmed the wick an hour earlier, and it had been fine. I relit it and watched it breathe. The flame leaned, faltered, and went out again. It's a small thing. You move on. On my way to the mausoleum, I passed two stones that always hit me. Peter K. Devine, 1982-2020, and 2 rows over, a smaller Peter Devine, 1951-1980, the same exact serif letters, same spacing, cut by different hands 40 years apart. Families repeat names, I know, but tonight the older one looked 2 shades lighter than it should, like it had been scrubbed recently. Wetness makes granite dark. This looked the opposite. I touched it and my glove came away dry as paper. I rubbed my glove against my jacket, rain dotting everything, and told myself the water runs weird on polished rock. My maglite beam bounced between the letters and the ground. At the mausoleum steps, the air felt colder, heavier, like the damp had a thickness to it. The door stands under a heavy portico, dark stone that drinks the lamplight, and the first step holds water the way a bowl does. We've had a drain clog there before. I carried the brass key Amos had hung on a nail inside the watchhouse door. It's the kind with a little shield stamped 17 on the head, the kind you want to fit somewhere. He told me he never found the right lock, just kept it because it looked like it belonged to something and because keys should stay with us, not end up on eBay. I tried it on the little service hatch on the side of the mausoleum where the hose connects, like I do every so often out of habit. It didn't fit. It never fits. I had the brass taste in my mouth and the feeling of a pressure almost under my boots. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I circled back through the moire plot to the caretaker shed. Water dripped off the ridge like a slow leak into a pan. Inside the shed, it smells like fuel and wet tarp. I checked the map pinned on the corkboard. Old paper with the sections and rows in a hand from the 1960s. Someone had faintly penciled a line between section C and the chapel path, the graphite shiny where it crosses the drainage ditch. It looked like Amos's printing, but he hadn't mentioned a reroute. The rain didn't knock all the damp off the paper there, which stuck to the cork at that new line. I wiped a smear of something from the trimmer guard and listened to the Motorola. Static collected and then clear. Open. It wasn't Tariq's voice. It wasn't anyone's. Then just the soft hiss and a squelch from the gate channel. I keyed the mic and heard my own breath. Repeat, I said. Nothing. My hands were colder than they should have been. When you work nights, you catalog small, wrong things. Damp soil where there shouldn't be foot traffic. I noticed a narrow line of dark new wetness along the far side of the Dawes mausoleum wall, like something had dripped from the seam. I ran my gloved finger along it and it came away with grit that wasn't mortar. Walking back, I saw the bell rope in the chapel sway maybe an inch while the rafters held still. The light from the nearest lamp flickered twice and steadied with a stubborn hum. I pulled the Fiskar shovel from the shed and stabbed the step's drain to loosen it. Mud sucked at the blade. The hum under the stone felt stronger when I did. That's not a sentence I knew how to think before. At 150, the outer gate rattled, one solid hit like a shoulder to the bars. I checked the lock again. Still sealed, but my skin registered it as warm where the fog kissed it. Heat and wet metal carry a certain smell like train tracks in summer rain, but weaker. I signed the check in the ledger at 0158, my signature starting to look like Amos's. I'm not joking. The habit is you copy the person who trains you so the book is legible. At 2:02, I took the brass key back out of my pocket because the weight was wrong. The tag read 17, But the one had a tiny tail now, like a 2 started and changed, and I told myself it had always been that way. I added a loop of tape. I walked the perimeter in the drizzle. The sodium lamps threw halos on the fog. I named stones as I passed. The way you learn streets on a new route. Raza, Klein, Vassallo, Perez. It steadies you to list what you know. At 2:14, the Motorola popped and squealed like when a taxi hits our channel. "Open," said the same neutral voice then. "Here." Tariq keyed in from the road, lighter tapping his knuckle, nervous voice too loud. "You just say here?" "Negative," I said. "Stay on the road." He laughed without humor and said he was watching the gate like I asked. He said he kept thinking he saw a girl or a small man in a dress, which I told him sounded like too much YouTube and not enough coffee. He said nothing for a while. The drizzle filled the time with patient noise. 217's not a real thing, he finally said. And I didn't answer because you never laugh at the one thing that keeps you checking locks. At exactly 2:17, my watch buzzing lightly against my wrist. The iron gate didn't just rattle, it unlatched. There's a sound to a heavy latch lifting, iron on iron, a hitch and a click. That sound came clear down the main path. I jogged to the gate, not running, never running, boots on stone, beam steady. The padlock was still through the loop. The latch was up as if someone held it and then set it down when they saw me. The space of a finger showed between the post and the gate. Fog pressed through the gap like breath under a door. I lowered the latch. My palm picked up a fine vibration. My mind tried to place it somewhere else so I wouldn't tie it to the thing I couldn't see. I stood with the gate for a full minute, counted breaths, then walked back toward the mausoleum because the idea of turning my back on it felt worse. On the way, I checked a stone that always makes me double take. Marla Harcourt, 1939-2016. It's spelled without the U. Her husband's is perfect. I know because her son pointed it out once and shrugged like he couldn't fix it now. Tonight, the U was there. Harcourt. Old chisel lines filled and smoothed by the same weather that had cut them. I put the beam close. Water ran along the letters. I took my glove off and traced the curve. It didn't feel new. It didn't feel at all. The glove went back on because my hand felt too warm in the wet air. Back by the watch house, the ledger sat on the desk next to the greasy thermos we never wash right. I flipped back to Arthur Kareem's entry. Thursday again. A faint smear of pencil made it look like something had been erased and rewritten. Joyce would never do that. On the next page, a note in my own block letters read, "Check side hatch." I hadn't written it. I know how I write when I'm tired. This had patience. The brass key in my pocket felt like it dragged me forward. The shed door resisted, swollen by the damp. Inside, the steel trimmer's pull cord hung a little farther out than normal, an inch of white line peeking. I put my hand on the handle and the tiniest buzz ran through it, like you get from a tin sign in a storm. People think cemeteries are loud at night because of animals. They're not. It's the small mechanics, water finding the lowest point, stone releasing heat, wood relaxing. The chapel's clock ticked in a slow mechanical way. The bell rope hung still. When I approached the mausoleum again, the drain at the step had finally surrendered. The water level had lowered a half-inch, revealing a brass plate set into the stone, greened at the edges. I had never seen it. I thought it was just a patch of moss before. My maglite showed a worn slot that looked like the mouth of a wrench, but wider. The brass key's shape suddenly made sense, not for a lock, but for a plate. When I say my heart sank, I mean I felt a physical drop in my chest because it meant this was a thing built to be used, and I was the only one here to use it. I set the key in the slot. It fit. A mild resistance, then a give, like something heavy long asleep gliding a few centimeters. The humming under the stone deepened. It had a layered quality now. Not loud but present like the inside of a transformer cabinet. The cold, damp air lifted the hair on my arms under the coat. I lifted the key out. The plate remained a fraction rotated. Water sluiced into a channel and slurped. The drain pulled. The pressure felt different, like the air was exhaling and then thinking better of it. I told myself it was old plumbing. I told myself that a tomb building might have a way to relieve groundwater. I took out the Fisker's shovel and angled the blade in the gap to clear silt. The shovel vibrated softly in my hand and my teeth locked on their own. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I keyed my radio because that's what you do when there's a change you can't name. "Maintenance at South Mausoleum," I said. "Copy?" Static. Then, the word again in that not voice pouring through like someone whispering close to the mic and far from it at the same time. "Here." The chapel lantern coughed broad light and went dark. My beam shook in my hand and made the wet steps blind and close. I tightened my grip. The rain built to a steady line of drops off the portico. The drain drank them all. There was a sound like wet fabric sliding, but nothing moved. The air tasted like battery terminals. Somewhere behind me at the chapel, the bell rope gave one light thump against wood as if someone had tested its weight. I took the brass key back to the plate and held it there without turning. The slight vibration ran up my arm and into my shoulder. My boot soles felt the way a train platform feels a second before you hear the train. I took a breath and thought about Amos wiping his glasses, about Joyce's pencil chewing, about Tariq tapping his lighter against his hand. People fix things by habit, not magic. Turn the thing that was made to be turned. It moved smoother on the second attempt, like the first rotation unstuck it for good. The plate made a full quarter turn, and I heard the firm internal slide of something metal engaging. The humming settled into a lower note that felt almost like quiet. The drain gurgled audibly and then stilled. For a full 5 seconds, there was only the rain and my breathing and the zinc taste in my mouth. Then the door to the mausoleum lightly touched against its frame. Not a slam, not even a push, just a breath of pressure and wood and stone acknowledging each other. I hadn't touched it. It sits flush enough you'd need both hands and a shoulder to move it. I put my palm against it to prove to myself it was shut. The metal was cold and dry, like it had been in a different air all night. The radio came alive with Tariq's voice. "Saw something at the gate," he said, breathless but trying to sound like he wasn't. Like a kid, barefoot. She stood to the left of the post and then, "I'm not messing with you." He was tapping his lighter so hard I could hear it. "Do you want me to come in?" "Negative," I said automatically. My eyes were on the brass key. It had warmed in my palm now, no longer cold as the plate. My body said, "Run what ifs." My training said, "Check what you can." I set the key on the top step, turned the mag light along the side hatch. You don't realize how much noise your coat makes until you're listening for anything else. A faint shiver worked through my fingertips where they held the flashlight. The engraved plaque on the mausoleum door lists family names, and my beam caught a wet shine across the lower right corner where the blank space is. The blank wasn't blank. Under the film of water was the impression of letters where there had never been any. A negative like someone pressing their thumb into wax. The impression spelled my last name. I blinked and moved the beam. The plaque went back to being a blank square. I'm told adrenaline makes your hearing narrow. Mine did the opposite. I heard the drip off the portico, the brush of a branch against the fence outside the wall, the slow inhale of the drain adjusting to its new channel. I heard my own boots adjust on the stone and the very small scuff that a key makes when you nudge it with your toe. I put it back in my pocket because the idea of leaving it there under sky felt wrong. Inside my pocket, it was warm as skin. I took the fiskers and worked the drain one more time out of stubbornness. The shovel's metal rang lightly on something deeper. Not a pipe, not hollow, but a tone like a tuning fork. The hum folded around it like two notes aligning. My stomach dropped that inch again. I pulled the shovel back and stood. The light from the path lamp went thin, dimming without going out. And then there was a mild sensation like the ground under the steps had flexed and returned. The way a dock settles when something large displaces the lake beside it. I told myself that language and old stone do things when the weather sits on them. I told myself I should check the chapel, the rope, the lantern, the ledger, anything that had fact on it. In the chapel, the brass candlesticks were wet as if they'd been carried in during rain even though they'd sat on the altar all day. The lantern on the side table, when I lifted the globe, smelled like the wick had burned long and hot and not like it had kept going out. I wiped the glass. The rope hung straighter than usual, no curve. Up in the little room above, the mechanism that Oliver, the old volunteer, insists we call a carillon even though it is 4 bells and a lot of optimism, sat still. On the way back down, the wood under my boot creaked like anyone's old stairs. The watch house window had collected a film of water inside, a trick of pressure. The ledger lay open to my note to Joyce. I touched the paper. It felt cold as if it had been outside. When I say I didn't panic, that's true. Panic feels like a sharp edge. This was more like an extra weight on the chest, not from running, but from having to choose what mattered and what could wait. I made a small, stupid choice then that feels important now. I took the brass key out again, traced the number 17 with my thumb, and put it on a nail inside the shed where Amos keeps it. I didn't want it on me. It clinked against the nail with a sound that sat in my ear longer than it should have. A high, dry ping. I left it and walked the path to the outer gate one more time. watching for Tariq's silhouette beyond the fence. He was there, hood up, lighter tapping stopped. He raised his hand and pointed once to the iron latch, not touching it. I looked. The latch was down as it should be. A print shone on the wet iron like a child's hand, small, half on the latch, half in the air. You know how a print fades as water fills it? This one held its shape for too long, then softened to nothing like any other wet mark. I told him to go home. He said he'd log it. I said I would. He nodded, tapped his knuckle twice with the lighter, and walked off along the road. His footsteps went away into the damp. By 3:10, the rain settled into a mist. I did the last rounds. The stones looked like shoulders under blankets. I put the Fiskars away, coiled the hose, closed the shed. The chapel lantern lit on the first try. The bell rope hung without moving. The mausoleum steps had no pool on them. The brass key stared from its nail, ordinary. The humming under the steps faded to a suggestion that might have been my own blood. I wrote the night's notes in the ledger. I wrote far too many concrete things like wattages and oil levels because they didn't move under my pen. My name looked like itself again. The sky lightened behind the spruce along the fence around 5:30. Morning doesn't happen in cemeteries so much as ease into being. The lamps clicked off one by one, and the fog lifted in thin rails and then in tatters. I made coffee in the watch house because it was a task with a start and an end. Amos came in early to check on me. He wiped his glasses without needing to and asked how the night went. I almost said the word humming out loud, but I didn't because he looked tired and grateful, and because it feels rude to bring something you don't understand to a man who keeps the place right out of habit. I told him about the drain and the plate. He nodded like he knew, but the way people nod to be polite. He reached for the key on the nail without looking and stopped short. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "Always been there," I said. He frowned, then smiled in that way you do when you realize you must have simply forgotten something and you're not 20. I walked the perimeter with him. We looked at the gate together. He ran his finger along the latch and shook his head like a mechanic hearing a rumor about a good engine. He hates stories because they make real work harder. He read my ledger notes and penciled a small check mark next to my list of lamps. "Good," he said, and he meant it. The pressure on my chest lifted in daylight without admitting it had been pressure.
Shift changes are like that.
You pass the weight and the responsibility without saying it has a shape. I went home, slept a thin few hours, came back at dusk with a cheap sandwich, and told myself it would be less. The ledger sat with my blue ink waiting for my name. Joyce left a sticky note about Arthur Kareem's date with a smiley face like she was teasing me for worrying. I made my rounds in a mist that tasted like old pipe. The lamps came on and everything went the same gunmetal color. The girl at the gate didn't exist because I didn't look for her. I checked the devils I knew. The drain, the rope, the trimmer, the dead cold plaque that had my name and then didn't. There is comfort in knowing where to put your eyes. When dawn came the second morning and nothing explicit had happened, I felt a relief I let myself believe. I locked the watch house and took the ledger to the office to leave it on Joyce's desk like I promised. The office smells like paper and flower water and hand sanitizer. I flipped to my notes to mark a question for the grounds crew in the margin. My blue name was there at 0203 and 0311 like it should have been, and then my eyes slid one line lower and stopped. Between yesterday's date and today's, on a line that had not existed when I closed the book at 0545, my signature sat in my own hand, steady and sure in black ink that wasn't ours. Time stamped 2112. The note attached said, "Key returned." Plate aligned. It was my block letters, the stubborn straightness of them. The crossbar on the T I learned from Amos, cleaner than I write when I'm tired. The brass key still hung on the nail in the shed where I had left it. My mouth went dry in air that stayed wet. I looked at the plate by the steps. It was exactly a quarter turn off from where it had started the night before. In the same position I had left it and convinced myself there was no other configuration to fear. I took a breath that felt like it went nowhere. Everything else was normal. Tariq signed the outer log with a scratch. Amos had circled a fuel order. Joyce had left another smiley face. The lantern wick received fire the first time and made that soft pop. The bell rope knocked gently and then hung without moving. The names on stone spelled themselves the way families chose them. If you didn't know to put a palm on the steps and feel for the faint, slow press of something, trying to decide whether to rise or stay, you would think the place had never drawn a different breath. The hum under the stone at 10 in the morning is something you can make into your own pulse if you want to be the kind of person who doesn't see his name where it shouldn't be. I went back that night and the night after, and I do my rounds the same way, and I try not to put the key in the plate unless the rain pools and outstays its welcome. But I hear it when I stop for just 1 second to listen to nothing, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now then, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard that night was water ticking off the gate like fingernails on a tin roof. The second was the soft wheeze of my own breath inside a damp mask, fogging my glasses whenever I tilted my head. I was halfway through the midnight patrol at Ashview Cemetery, shoulder to the wind, checking the lower path where the road splits around the chapel and slides toward the family mausoleums. The drizzle had been steady all day, the kind that seeps into everything and makes old stones smell like wet coins. I'm the night caretaker, the one who does the final round after the day crew clocks out. And this happened on a Tuesday near the end of October, 3 weeks into covering double shifts because Malik's lungs were acting up again. If you've never done a night alone in a big cemetery, you probably think it's quiet. It isn't. It is a world built for small sounds. There's runoff ticking through gutters, branches shedding droplets with hollow plips, a gate hinge thinking about moving, the wire of a chain-link fence humming when the wind pushes it just right. Even the dead weight of wet grass has a sound. I know most of them. This night had its own catalog. Rain on my hood, the far sodium lamps turning the fog into a dull yellow smear, my Motorola radio grumbling with static at my hip, the soft scrape of my boots on squeaky, wet gravel. I had my mag light and a thermos in the watch house, and the Fisker's shovel leaned by the door because one time a raccoon dragged half a wreath into the culvert and I needed to fish it out. I stick to routines. Routines make the dark smaller. I started at the office to sign the log. Ruth, who does afternoons, always leaves the ledger open to the right date and wipes her glasses with the same square of t-shirt she keeps in her pocket. She underlines the day once, hard enough that you can feel the groove in the paper. When I arrived, the page was already underlined, but there was a faint second underline that hadn't cut as deep. I wrote my name anyway, the time, 11:16 p.m., and tucked the brass key back on its hook by the door. The key has a big head, stamped with a number no one recognizes anymore, and a greasy shine that never goes away. It came with the place long before my time. We call it the orphan. Malik taps his lighter next to it like a metronome whenever he tells the story about the old watch house that used to be on the south wall, and the bell rope that connected to a lantern pulley. Different people, same habits, he says, and taps the lighter again. The first off thing I noticed outside was the western gate. I had unlocked it before dinner to let the monument truck through and hung the padlock over the chain so I could close it later. Now it was shut again, chain threaded and locked. It wasn't cruel weather. The rain came straight down, the wind was lazy, but the padlock was wet and the keyhole had a tiny, bright bead of water in it like an eye. I swore at myself for being forgetful and opened it, making a note to tell Ruth to check the security cam in the morning, then stepped back to watch the chain hang right. Metal is honest. When it's wrong, it says so. At the lower path, I saw the headstone everyone calls the Weeper. The real name on it is Anders Kaminsky, 1948 to 2022. His daughter had asked us to polish it after 3 separate mornings, where the marble came up streaked with dark stains that looked like runoff. It only happened when fog sat low and the stone tasted like iron when I handled it. I know the taste because I wiped my gloves across it one morning and bit the thumb to pinch the glove off. It left a metallic smear on my tongue that took hours to fade. We replaced the slab in June. New marble, sealed edges. The next fog morning, the new one had bled too. We keep a rag in the caretaker's shed just for it. Tonight there were faint tear tracks again. They were lighter in this drizzle, but still there, 2 determined lines. I wiped them clean and stood quiet. Somewhere water shifted in a pipe, a thin droning behind the chapel like a distant heater turning on. The second odd thing was simple. The chapel door, which we never lock because there's nothing to steal besides benches and a dusty piano, was shut from the inside. I could feel it give and bounce on something soft. When I put my shoulder to it, it swung in and trimmed a wet line across the floor, A funeral program lay face down, one from earlier that week. The name Yunji Park written in a delicate serif, the date already marked in our ledger by Ruth's careful hand. The pages were damp and stuck. The air smelled like old varnish and rain. I clicked the mag light across the pews and turned it off again when the beam hit the glass of the window and came back at me, yellow from the sodium lamps. The chapel has a way of making you loud even when you're still. I set the program on the back pew to dry. Third thing, a date wrong on a grave. Section 6, row D, where the small markers are set in a tight grid. Someone had chalked 2025 into the damp cement border around a fresh plot flagged for a December burial. We keep those borders clean for mower wheels. The chalk was recent. I brushed it out with my boot and told myself some kids had hopped the fence. It happens. On the far fence line, the neighborhood throws out its glass like confetti. The fact didn't change the little climb my heart did. I kept walking. The fog thickened in the low spots. The air had that metallic edge that makes you swallow just to clear it. Under the pepper trees by the back wall, the ground dropped to an old drain, from when the city still used the canal to keep the field from flooding. It hasn't been hooked up in years. We cover it with a steel grate, and every so often the grate hums when the wind lines up. I angled my mag light toward the lamplight to keep my night vision intact and realized I was listening hard for something else. The mausoleum steps climb up from there, 4 shallow risers, slick and dark. For the first time that night I thought, not about wind, but about a note that didn't fit the weather. It was a thin sound, not a draft, not a pipe, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I said it out loud to fix it in my mind, and the sentence made me uncomfortable the way repeating your own name does. By the maintenance yard gate I met Theo, one of the day guys cutting back through with his hood up. He shouldn't have been there at that hour. He shrugged when he saw me and tapped the side of his head where his earbuds sat under the beanie. "Forgot my charger," he said, breath white, accent thick from the village his family came from. He always hummed when he worked, 3 notes over and over without noticing. It made the battery closet sound like a fridge. I told him to lock the shed on his way out. He nodded, pushed past, and I watched his boot prints fill with water as he disappeared into fog that swallowed him 3 headstones away. On the radio, the daily weather channel twitched and repeated a warbling syllable that could have been low or no, or just static chewing its own tongue. In the shed, the Fisker's shovel was still by the door, and the steel trimmer leaned on the pegboard. The trimmer smelled like mowed grass even when it's clean, a permanent green bite that gets into the wood of the handle. Someone had set the plot map on the bench under the window. It had water stains that made Europe-shaped islands across Section 9. Malik writes NA in pencil when a grave is not available because of roots or a misplaced pipe. There were 2 new NA notes in his handwriting for plots by the mausoleum. He hadn't been on the ground since Friday. He taps his lighter when he thinks and then writes. I ran my finger over the graphite and smudged it, then wiped my hand on my jacket and opened the drawer to make sure the brass key was in the little tin where we sometimes keep it. It wasn't, which meant I'd left it on the hook, which I never do at night. I put the map back and told myself that habit can lie. I did the east loop by the Stone Angels and the older plots where the dates go back to the 1920s. Names with faded paint: Nora Walcott, Janusz Bielecki, Marta Chu. A bell rope hangs on a post by an empty flower stand there, an old joke. Years ago, a group of kids strung it up to ring like a cemetery ghost prank. We left it because someone tied a nice knot and it made tourists smile in daylight. Tonight, the rope was still wet and darker at the bottom, where it soaked up water from the stand. As I swished my light across it, it gave a tiny sway. Not enough to be called a swing, but enough for the fringe to lift and drop with a complicated little dark motion. When I stood still, it stood still. When I stepped, it twitched like a cat's tail. That made sense: air, motion, rain, so I moved on. At the far outer road by the gatehouse, I checked the second lock. The gate was supposed to be open for the monument truck in the morning, but Ruth had asked me to leave the padlock threaded so it would look secure from the street. The chain was neatly arranged, and the lock was closed through the last link. The orphan brass key should open anything old on this property, or that's what Malik likes to say. He says it with his lighter tapping the table and a half frown that means he's teasing himself for liking a story. My hand went to my pocket without thinking. Nothing. Back to the office then, I told myself. Get the key, finish the path, make the note, coffee. Inside the watch house, the coffee was cold and tasted like a metal railing. The ledger was where I'd left it, but my name was written twice. The first time was my handwriting, 11:16 p.m., my usual shaky J. The second line was mine too, same shape to the letters, but the time read 2:03 a.m. It was 12:38 a.m. by the office clock, which loses 2 minutes a week unless you tap it. I tapped it and it didn't change. The brass key was not on its hook, and the empty hook looked like a finger pointing at me. I checked the tin in the shed again, even though I had just checked it. Empty. I set the mag light on the desk and ran my hands through the drawer. Batteries, pens, the little labeler we use to mark vases. Nothing heavy and cold like brass. I went back out into the drizzle because staying inside with the numbers made my chest feel tight. The fog made distance short and close things appear and vanish. My breath made a ribbon in the beam. The angels looked slick and new and mean under the lamps. By then I had 6 small things written in my head. Wrong lock, weeping stone, program in the chapel, chalked date, rope twitch, duplicated signature. 7 when I added the missing key. 8 when I heard the humming again near the mausoleum steps. Not louder exactly, but deeper, like when a truck idles behind a wall and you hear the note instead of the engine. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I said it again without wanting to, and it felt like answering a question I hadn't been asked. There are 2 family mausoleums at Ashview with proper steps. Big cubes of stone that hold generations like a set of drawers. The older one belongs to the Caros. Their name is chipped like chalk, and the door has a heavy brass handle with a patina that looks like moss. The newer one is for the Kaminskis and 2 in-laws who married in. We maintain the drains at the base because water wants to live there. If leaves clog the grate, the whole platform weeps into the door seam. I decided to clear it to feel like I'd done something that made sense. I swung the Fiskars shovel onto my shoulder, clipped the mag light to my jacket front, and walked up. The rain was that tight mist that makes eyelashes feel heavy. The light from the near lamp flickered once and caught itself. Somewhere behind me, the chain on the west gate clinked. I'm telling you what I remember because the memory has the feel of wet metal. I focused on work. I knelt and scraped leaves away from the grate with the shovel, then with my gloves feeling the cold push into the knuckles. The drain was only 6 inches wide, a long slot like a mail slot for rain. It should have echoed if I tapped the metal. When I did, the tap got swallowed like the air underneath had the soft of a wool blanket. The hum was down there. It wasn't singing or electricity. It was a held note and it had texture. The mag light beam made the wet grate shine, then vanish in a dark that wasn't the color of storm runoff. I fished my phone for a photo and the lens immediately fogged. I wiped it on my sleeve, which made it worse. The door to the mausoleum had a keyhole the size of an almond, even though I've never seen a key that big on the grounds. My gloved hand went to my pocket again, empty. The lights on the path took a slow breath and buzzed. The Motorola chirped and whispered what could have been low again, just that clipped syllable. It repeated it twice and then was quiet. I don't scare easily, but I know when I'm mistaken about an environment. I stood up, leaned the shovel against the step, and put my ear near the seam of the door where the bronze meets stone. The metal smelled like pennies. The hum wasn't from the drain after all. It stood right behind the seam like it had a mouth against it. Sound travels fast in cold air. This was not the fast sound. It was patient. It felt like warmth on your ear, except it was cold. My eyes watered. The sodium lamps cast nothing into the opening. The dark was right there, and right there is different than far away. I turned the handle because it was there. It didn't move. It shouldn't move. Those doors are sealed. The steps were slick, and my knee made a damp slap against them when I shifted. I placed my other hand on the door to steady myself and felt vibration humming under my palm. It went up into my wrist bone and did something unpleasant to my teeth. I took my hand away and went back to the grate, because procedures are the rope you hold. Clear the drain, check the seal, log the maintenance. When I stood to go back for the rake, I saw the brass key lying against the riser 2 steps down. It looked heavier in the rain, darker. Not like any brass that shines, but like it had soaked up the weather. The stamped number, 3031, caught the light, then lost it again under the waterskin. I crouched slow, reached for it, and had the dumb thought that if my glove touched it, there would be a little shock. There wasn't. It was cold enough to make my fingers hurt through the glove. The edges were oily, like always. I held it up and the humming stepped forward. I don't have better words for that. It didn't get louder. It moved toward the key. My chest did that small panic thing and I breathed with the trick they teach you for winter work. Countin' 4, out 6, to calm the nerves that make your hands clumsy. I have learned that when you don't know a thing, make it ordinary. I told myself Ruth might have dropped the key earlier and brushed it under the step with her boot. It got caught there. The time in the ledger was a mistake. The locks happen. The rope happens. The weeping stone is a mineral stain feeding on iron in the stone or something leaching out from the soil. People write dates down wrong. The hum is a transformer in the neighborhood. Theo lost his charger. He'll laugh about forgetting his charger. I said all those things in my head like I was reading them to a kid who wouldn't sleep. The lock plate under the mausoleum handle was old. Brass and brass. My hand was shaking when I brought the key near the keyhole and it surprised me by fitting not quite. The square shoulders met a round throat. I shouldn't have tried, but I had the boot-heel pride of a groundsman about finishes and old metal. I adjusted, turned the key and felt it settle with the kind of click you hear with your molars. The door didn't open. The step below me made a tiny, gravely sound like something under the slab shifted and found a new equilibrium. Rain ticked. The lamp buzzed. My breath bounced off the door and made my face damp under the hood. The humming went down into the steps like someone took their mouth off the seam and put it against the riser. Sound through stone is not like sound through air. It makes the air around you small. The radio hissed and repeated the same single syllable, softer now, low, which made me look at the battery indicator without thinking. Full bars. I toggled to channel 1 and asked if anyone was near the lower field. The answer was my own voice coming back a half-second late. I changed to 3 and got nothing. I don't claim an explanation. The maglite pulse stuttered once, a bug in the LED that happens when it wants a new battery. I tapped the base against my wrist and the beam steadied. Behind me, the bell rope gave a small persuading motion like a hand under it. This place has drafts inside its drafts. I could taste metal again, colder than ever. A taste like when you touch your tongue to a 9-volt just to see if it still has life. I turned the key back, pulled it out, and the humming came up through the riser like air through a reed. It had a pattern now. I could convince myself of a pattern. 3 seconds, quiet, 2 seconds, quiet, 3 again. If you're around life support units long enough, everything becomes a machine in your head. The pattern worked on my nerves worse than randomness, so I did the next ordinary thing. I went around the side of the mausoleum to check the downspout, because maybe the hum was a line carrying water and the grate was acting like a soundboard. I planted the Fisker shovel to steady myself on the slick grass and rounded the corner into a deeper fog pocket that blurred the lamplight into a dull halo. Earthworms scatter on the surface in this weather. I stepped around 3 and apologized for the 4th I didn't see soon enough. You'll think that detail is silly. You'd be surprised what becomes important when you're trying to keep your head clear. The downspout was clear. The grate on this side had a single wet maple leaf plastered over it. I peeled it away, and below, instead of the damp soil I expected, there was a dark gap big enough for a fist where the ground had changed shape. I angled the maglite in and saw a stone. It wasn't a void in dirt. It was a recess like a box with a lid that hadn't been poured or had been poured and later cut. A little door under the step, stone faced with metal somewhere in its sandwich. I reached in with 2 fingers, touched cold, and felt a threaded edge, the kind that expects a screw cap or a key. The brass key in my pocket got heavy like a dare. That was the moment the lamps along the path did a longer flicker, and the rain's sound briefly changed, as if the drizzle were heavier without landing harder. My jacket found water down the collar and I flinched more from the sensation than surprise. I slid the key toward the recess. My glove squeaked on the wet. The key shaft didn't fit a rotation hole, but the head's cutouts lined up in a way I can't explain politely, except to say I recognized the feeling of a tool in the right place. The click was delicate but undeniable. The humming stopped. The silence was not relief. It was like the hum had been the weight on a rope, and when you remove the weight, the rope slaps the pulley. My ears chilled. The radio spoke in my own voice again, saying the time and my name. The bell rope swayed further than a draft would have managed. The door seam made a damp kiss sound, like 2 wet fingers peeled apart. And then the steps exhaled. The air that came up from under them was not warm and not cold. It was the exact temperature of a hand you don't know touching you in the dark. If you think you know what you do, you don't. If the thing I expected had been visible, I would have had a way to handle it. Even a rat has eyes and a shape you can angle a shovel at without being cruel. This was not a thing. It was a pressure that made the muscles along my jaw tighten on their own. The smell was wet stone and old canvas, and a smell that only lives in basements where there used to be water. I kept my hand on the key head because pulling it out felt like giving up mid-sentence. The downspout behind me ticked. Above me, the lamplight leaned into the fog and backed away.
I wanted someone to call my name like they do when it's time to lock up. The way Ruth sings the first syllable like a bell. Or the way Malik rolls it with a half laugh.
Theo hums without realizing. The place offered none of that. The humming returned, but now it was inside my skull. A substitute for air. A marker for where to put panic. Here is where I tell you about staying practical. I stepped back. I put the mag light in my mouth, bit down on the rubber of the tail so I could use both hands, gravel grinding under my boots, shoulder finding rain. I took the Motorola off my belt and pressed the call button until the light blinked red, then green, then red, like it does when it's thinking about connecting. I said my name. The section, Kaminsky Mausoleum, need a second pair of hands, knowing there was no one on call but pretending there was. I took the Fisker's shovel and jammed the blade across the little door seam and leaned, not to pry but to present weight, to give the situation something to argue with that wasn't my head. The shovel flexed a little and made its own small metal groan, one that belonged to this world. The humming in my skull beat against the tool's sound. I went blind for a second like you do when you stand too fast. The pressure under the steps receded as if the shovel had reminded it about the logic of objects. The rain sounded like rain again. My teeth ached from clenching. I took the key out from the recess in a clean motion, pocketed it, then pulled the shovel away and listened. Nothing happened. I waited longer, the way you count after a lightning flash to find the thunder, except there wasn't even a storm to blame. The lamp steadied. A car hissed along the far street beyond the fence. I said to the empty air, because I had to hear the voice, "I am closing the downspout grate for the night." That is how I wrote it later, too. I reseated the grate with both hands, my gloves bleeding water. Then I closed the little stone lid inside as far as it would close without force. It slid the way a new drawer slides, reluctantly but evenly. By the time I got back to the watch house, the jacket had stuck to my wrists and the lining smelled like old soap. I logged the maintenance. I underlined the date. I wrote out like a police report that there had been humming under the steps, that I had investigated the drain, that I had reseated an internal plate, that the humming ceased. I don't believe in writing feelings in a log. The brass key was on the hook where it belonged. I did not put it there. I locked the office and walked the perimeter one more time, like a man checking the stove twice before he leaves for work, like checking a sleeping kid twice to make sure the chest rises. The rope by the angels was still heavy with water. The program I'd left on the back pew in the chapel had dried into a curl. The weeping stone was clean. The wrong date in chalk was gone because I had wiped it out. The padlock on the west gate hung open like a question mark because I had left it that way. Dawn comes sideways into Ashview. It doesn't rise so much as lose its patience with the fog. The lamps click off one by one and the fog becomes smaller grays instead of one big wall. Birds found the wires. Car tires hiss. Ruth arrived at 6 sharp, wiping her glasses, hair frizzed from the drizzle. She asked if the monument truck had called. I said I hadn't seen them yet, and she said she'd phone after coffee. I told her to check the camera for the west gate from around 11, and to mark the Kaminsky drain as needing a proper cap when Malik felt up to it. She looked right at me the way she does when she wants to see if I've slept, and then she glanced past me to the ledger. "You work in thirds now?" she asked, light. Her finger was on the 2:03 a.m. line. The ink had bled into the paper like it had been written on damp stock. The underline through the date was deeper this morning, and there was a smudge at the end of my name. I told her I'd written one time and that maybe the pen had bled. I made a joke about cheap ballpoints. We laughed the way people laugh at work to keep the gears moving. I walked her through the maintenance notes and left her in the office to call the truck. Outside, the drizzle had given up and was just wet air. The lamps gave their final tick as they shut down. I went back to the mausoleum with the idea that daylight would make the steps look like steps. Everything looked honest in the morning. The grate was where I'd left it. The drain smelled like wet leaves. I knelt to brush a stray twig away and saw the edge of the little stone lid. The keyed recess I'd found in the dark was no longer a recess. It was smooth concrete, old finish, modeled the way the rest of the base is modeled. When I pressed my fingertip to where the thread had been, I felt nothing but cold. Concrete takes its own time from you. I walked back slow to the watch house, palms aching from where they'd met cold stone. Theo came in at 8, humming a song that maybe had words once. He apologized for leaving the shed open and lifted his beanie to scratch the groove it had put in his forehead. Malik showed up around 9 with his cough wrapped in a scarf and tapped his lighter 3 times by the key hook before he said good morning. I was tired in a way that water and coffee can't fix. I went out to the weeper to see if the sun made it plain. The marble had dried into a clean blank. When I looked down, I saw the cuff of my glove was stained brown in a spot I hadn't noticed, a thin line along the seam where I had handled the stone. I raised it to my nose because I am the kind of person who checks. The smell was iron. It made my teeth feel hollow. That's not why I'm telling you this part, though. The reason I'm telling you this is that I went back into the watch house to put my gloves on the heater and saw the ledger open on the desk. There was a new line under the 2:03 a.m. one. It was mine, neat as if I'd rested my wrist before writing. Under step secured. All quiet. Ruth hadn't touched the book yet. She was still on the call with the monument truck, telling them to watch their speed on the outer road. My handwriting looked like I write when I've had time to care about letters. The time next to it read 5:41 a.m., a time I spent standing at the east fence watching the lamps die. I touched the paper. It was dry. The groove of the pen sat in the sheet like a vein. Back on the hook, the brass key had a wet halo under it, even though nothing else on the wall was wet. I don't know what you do when the object that meant one thing has to mean another. I wiped the halo with a paper towel and left the towel in the trash. After that, I did my list like it was a test I could pass by neatness. Around noon, the sun burned a thin hole through the cloud rack and painted everything a color that didn't belong to morning or afternoon. Ruth signed out at 2, glass cloth already in her pocket. Malik headed home to his scarf. Theo wheeled the trimmer back to the shed and hummed that 3-note thing he always hums. I walked once more to the mausoleum because a person can keep a promise to themselves even when they don't believe it came from them. The steps looked like steps. The grate looked like a grate. The air was the air. If the idea of a thing is wrong, I told myself it will shrink away if you stare. I can be stubborn. I stood there until my back ached. When I turned to go, the hum was there again, shaped by daylight into a whisper of a machine that isn't mine. I don't know how long I let myself listen before I made my legs move. The danger never named itself. That's the part that's hard to carry across into words. I left my shift clean, no drama, no confession. Only when I got home and washed my hands did the water run clear without that metallic edge. I slept as if sleep were work, then came back the next night to do the same path. The west gate was as I'd left it. The program in the chapel was gone because Ruth had tidied. The rope did not move. The chalk had been rinsed by the drizzle. The ledger had a blank line for me. I told myself the first time was a hiccup in a day that started wrong. I told myself October weather does strange things to stone. I told myself it is my job to keep things ordinary for the people who come here to do the hard part of living, the part where they remember. I did not tell anyone about the little lidded space that isn't there in the daylight, or about how the brass key being exactly where it should be made me more uneasy than finding it wrong. I did not tell them that when I close my eyes now, I can feel where the key fit, not in the hand, but in the part of your head that protects you from knowing too much about where you work. Eventually, days piled and made time feel real again. We did a burial in Section 9. We drove the cart along the path and the tires made that soft hiss. When we got back, I initialed the ledger and underlined the date like Ruth does because she was home with a headache. The paper had that same faint second underline like a shadow. At the very bottom of the page, the last line had been filled in already, neat like a promise someone had kept on my behalf. Under steps secured. All quiet. The time was 6 hours ahead of the clock on the wall. When I went out for my final loop, the fog had returned, thin and careful. The lamps clicked on with a buzz and turned the air the color of old bones. At the base of the mausoleum steps, there was a new dampness on the stone I hadn't seen all day. It wasn't rain. It traced an oval around the risers like a seal. I put my hand down. The stone was not cold. It had the exact temperature of a hand that shouldn't be there. The sound was back where it had started the first night, and I said the sentence like it was the only way to keep the space from growing teeth. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts. and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard was metal tapping in the watch house, the soft clicks of Ed's lighter opening and closing again. The rain on the window screens made a steady sound like soda fizz. I was coiling extension cords that still smelled like grass when the tower light stuttered across the cemetery and held steady. I had looked at that light for months without thinking about it. That night it felt like it had turned to face me. I'm the night caretaker at Pine Hollow Cemetery in Sedgwick County, Kansas. And this was during my last week before I was supposed to switch to days. The place isn't big, but it's old. Wrapped by a cracked outer road and a field that never drains right. The tower is a brick watchtower that everyone just calls the watch house, even though it's a tower attached to a one-room office with a rusted stove. The county sealed the tower stairs with a steel door in 1958 after a kid fell from the catwalk. They left the lantern up there anyway. Nobody climbs. The light runs now on a sensor and a maintenance circuit that the city refuses to diagram. People from town say Samuel Orr poured the tower foundation alone, and they set his stone right into the base wall. I've looked at the inscription. It's half covered by moss and the letters are shallow, like whoever carved it was tired. Ed tapped his lighter because the rain made him nervous. He's done nights here for years, the kind of guy who walks a place and asks out loud if anything needs doing. Marisol was finishing a last pass with the steel trimmer along the walk to the chapel. She hums under her breath without thinking, a tune that sounds like how dust settles. Father Brennan from St. Marcus sometimes stops by and wipes his glasses while he talks, leaving streaks, then wipes again. That night it was just me and Ed on duty. Marisol signed the log and left her ear protection on the peg. Said she'd be back at sunrise to pick up the debris. She said watch the low spots because the water pooled and the sod was slick. Then it was just rain, the sodium lamps, and the smell of wet stone. The first small thing was a grave recorded under the wrong date. The logbook is a battered 3-ring binder with the plastic peeling. Every burial gets a typed line from Connie at the office, and I add the diagram coordinates. I was doing an end-of-shift check even though it wasn't the end of the shift yet. Page 312 said Daily Hue, Interment Friday. It was Wednesday. I stared at it until the ink felt like it might smear. I checked the little metal tag at the head of the open plot, and the tag said Friday too. The backhoe had opened the trench earlier that day, and we had tarps over it now to keep it from sloughing in. I told myself Connie typed it wrong and the tag got pulled from the wrong drawer. I penciled a question mark and turned the page. The tower lantern flickered hard twice and came back. The air inside the office had that cold metallic smell of damp paper and old nails. Ed asked me if I'd locked the outer gate after Marisol left. I'd locked it. He went to check and came back with rainwater drip-lining the shoulders of his coat and said the chain was re-looped through the bars like someone had done it twice. I said maybe I'd been half asleep and ran it through both times. He tapped his lighter once. It sounded like a coin set down on a table. Outside the watch house, the lamps blinked the way sodium lamps do, a pulse and then steady. Water pooled in the ruts along the outer road and the fog came in from the fields like it prefers to crawl up from the ground. I walked to the chapel to bring in the mag light I'd left leaning against a pew earlier. The wind didn't make it in through the broken leaded panes, and candles that we never light smelled like cold wax. When I stepped back outside, my boot landed in damp soil next to a row of stones that always sits on rock-hard ground. I looked up at the sky out of habit, expecting clear stars. There were no stars, just low orange. I told myself I was misremembering last week. The second thing was a lantern in the shed that wouldn't stay lit. We keep a little hurricane lantern for when the breaker trips. It's not supposed to be inside because of fumes, but it's been there since the steel fuel cans were new and nobody yelled. I lit it, watched the flame steady, set it on the bench, turned to pick up a coil of trimmer line, and the lantern went out. I relit it, it died. I changed the wick, it died. I left it cold on the bench and took the mag light. I cut across the east section. The stones out there are mostly flat to the ground. One name repeated more than once, Pritchard. I knew it already, but it looked like the same dates were carved twice, and the second stone was half sunk, so the 6s and 8s looked like they were trying to trade places. My beam picked up fresh trimmer line loops in the grass like little blue snakes. I set one in my pocket so it wouldn't tangle the mower deck tomorrow. The radio on my belt hissed. It's a fat Motorola with a cracked rubber antenna sleeve. Ed had the other one back in the office. The hiss cleared and I heard a whisper that might have been a word or might have been the rain. I said my name and asked if he'd called. Nothing. I adjusted the volume dial and had to pull my glove off to do it because the knurling bites. At the mausoleum, the steps stay slick. They hold a sheen even on dry days like someone mopped them. There's a drain that never drains. I stood at the top step and shoved the mag light under my arm to get the key ring off my belt. The brass key hangs on its own split ring with a little tag stamped chapel. It doesn't match the other keys, which are all dull nickel. It showed up in the bottom of the ledger drawer on my second day, and it doesn't fit the chapel. It doesn't fit anything. I keep it because my hand learns shapes and I notice when a shape is missing. I checked the lock even though the mausoleum has had a keypad since last year. The keypad stuttered, blinked, and then gave me the green. The door stuck and released with the sound of sealant peeling off paint. I listened before I stepped inside. That's a habit I didn't have before this place. The first time I heard it was like when you stand near a transformer or the back of a soda machine. A note under the noise. I thought it might be the dehumidifier running in the corner, except the dehumidifier wasn't on. It had a tag across the plug that said unplugged until further notice. I stepped closer to the steps where the concrete interior stairwell goes down to the crypt room the public doesn't use. The wording came into my head without me choosing it. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I said it in my head, not out loud, and it made my mouth feel dry. I told myself there are fans somewhere in the building. I clicked the light off and on, and the sound didn't change. On the way back to the watch house, I passed the small bell tower over the chapel door. It's a decorative thing that never rang, but someone years ago ran a rope so kids could play pretend during the fall tours. The rope hangs inside the entry vestibule because people kept stealing it. It was moving very slightly side to side. I put my mag light on the floor and watched to see if my own movement was causing it. The motion kept going. A small arc, as if it was finishing something and didn't want to look like it had been doing it. I closed the door. When I opened it again a minute later, the rope was still. Ed was at the desk with the logbook open to the entries for the week. He tapped the lighter twice, set it down, then moved it so it would sit parallel to the edge of the desk. He has a thing with right angles. He said the outer gate was locked and chained with the county padlock, which was good, but the little brass key I keep on the hook was missing. The brass key with the chapel tag. I told him I had it on me. He looked relieved and then asked why I'd taken it. I didn't have a good answer. I wrote a note in the margin of the log that said brass key in my possession and drew an arrow to my name and the time. The wall clock ticked like a metronome playing slow. The rain on the roof came in a new pattern that meant standing water somewhere had just overflowed. The radio hissed again, and the hiss became a word. It repeated itself once like the radio was thinking. It sounded like here. That's what I heard, but radio noise does that, syllables and static that your brain grabs and calls meaningful. I asked Ed if he'd heard it. He said he'd set his radio on the charger, which only sometimes works because the contacts are corroded, and it had clicked and gone quiet. He hadn't said anything. I told him I was going to walk the outer road and check the gate again. He didn't laugh, but his face did something like he wanted to. He tapped the lighter twice. The outer road is narrow with a ditch on the field side and the cemetery fence on the other. The sodium lamps make shadows of the fence bars that look like they're bending. The ditch fills with cattails in summer, but now it was just black water and cut stems. The chain at the gate was pulled tight around the bars and padlocked. I checked the padlock and it was hammered with rust the way it always is, but the shackle was bright and burnished where it touched the chain, like someone had opened and closed it an hour ago. On the way back, I passed the caretaker shed and saw light under the door. The hurricane lantern was lit. I hadn't left it lit. The flame was low and steady. I opened the door and the flame went out. I stepped inside and it smelled like hot metal cooling. The steel trimmer lay on the bench with a clean spool of line and no fuel cap. I found the cap on the floor under the bench. I'm careful about the trimmer because if you leave it wrong, the tank leaks and the shed floor keeps the smell for days. When I came out, the tower lantern made a slow arc and came still. Fog wrapped the base like cotton batting. The drip from the roof edge hit the same spot on the stone with a sound like a clock's second hand. I felt the stupid thought that if I looked up, I'd see someone leaning on the catwalk rail. I made myself not look up. Back in the office, Ed had set the logbook aside and pulled the old plot map out of the drawer. It's a big folded sheet covered in pencil over pencil. He had his reading glasses down on his nose and his shoulders looked like he was trying not to take up much space. He told me the Morton plot numbers didn't match the tags, and he pointed to a square labeled Lyle R. Morton 1919-1996, and the same name again one row over with 1919-1998. Both were penciled by different hands. We walked out there and checked the little aluminum name tags on the corner stakes. One read 1919-1996, and another read 1919-1998. The stones themselves, flat to the ground, gave the same two sets, and the brackets holding the tags had new zip ties that didn't match the ones we use. I asked if Connie had sent anyone out. He said no, the rain felt colder. The drizzle hit the back of my neck where my hood gapped and ran down under my shirt. We were quiet passing the mausoleum. I didn't want to hear anything. The fog made the lamps feel close to the ground. The keypad by the door to the crypt level blinked on its own once and showed all 8s, then went dead. Ed said the keypad does that when there's moisture, and we both pretended it always shows 8s. He ran his thumb hard along the grain of his lighter, and the rasping sound felt wrong in that damp air. The next thing was a key that didn't fit any door. The brass key had never fit anything, but when I reached for it on my belt, it wasn't there. I stopped walking and patted all my pockets the way you do in airports, and my stomach dropped. I told Ed the key was gone. He asked if I'd left it in the office. I hadn't. I said I'd go back and check, and he said he'd walk the perimeter of the Morton plots. When I turned, my boot slid on something slick that wasn't moss and wasn't algae. The tread of the heel made a squeak I can still hear if the room is quiet enough. I put the mag light on that spot, and the water there vibrated slightly like a phone buzzing on a table. I told myself it was a gust pushing the puddle. In the office, the radio on the charger was on. It shouldn't have been because the charger is temperamental. The LED glowed a sick orange and the speaker made a sound like breath. Then a word tried to form and didn't. I picked it up and thumbed the side transmit and said my name and that I was in the watch house. The other radio, the one on my belt, hissed, and then I heard my own voice repeated back at me from somewhere near the door, slightly delayed. I told myself I had keyed both radios by accident and they were feeding back, but the one in my hand wasn't transmitting. The green transmit LED wasn't on. I put it down. Movement on the window glass made me look. It was only rain. The tower light swung again and steadied. I told myself I was done telling myself things and went back out. The chapel vestibule smelled like wet rope. I checked the bell rope again. It wasn't moving. I bumped it gently with 2 fingers and felt resistance like the rope was heavier than rope. The clapper in the little bell didn't sound and there was no ring. Just a dull metal knock like someone tapping a radiator with a knuckle far away. There are security cameras here, the kind you get grants for, but they record to a DVR that loses days whenever the power flickers. We've watched hours of compressed dampness in that office and never learned anything. I didn't go back to the monitors. I went to the mausoleum. The keypad didn't light at all when I pressed it. My mag light beam shook a little and I got mad at my hand for trembling. I gripped the handle and pulled, and the door gave like it had been waiting for the pull. Like something on the other side had already pulled and was grateful to stop. The smell inside wasn't death. People always think that. The smell was stone and damp and the penny tang of old metal. The dehumidifier was unplugged. The little bucket inside it was full of rain from who knows when. I could hear water dripping off a railing down the interior stairs. I braced my hand on the cool wall without meaning to. My glove squeaked. I stood at the top and listened the way you listen for your name in a crowded room. I'm not dramatic. I don't imagine voices. I heard it the way you hear if a garage door opener is on. The frequency found something in my jaw and made my teeth feel soft. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. If I'd said it out loud, it would have sounded like I was reading it off a sign. I took 1 step down and the sound changed like it noticed me. I stopped and waited. The rain on the tower roof made a ticking counterpoint. My radio hissed. I took another step. The beam of my mag light caught a thin line of water running along the stair edge. It gathered and dripped at the landing at a regular pace that didn't match the rain. Negative space between drips is a thing you can feel. The crypt room at the bottom isn't large. We keep excess markers down there, blank marble pieces that we order if a family is slow to decide. There's a rolling steel shelf with cardboard boxes marked with names and dates, brass vases and little hardware kits. The concrete floor holds a crack that looks like someone drew a map of a river delta with a screwdriver. It's dry down there even on wet nights, except this night. Tonight, my boots found a shallow film on the concrete, enough to make a darker boot print when I lifted my foot. In the far left corner, beneath the first run of stairs, the noise was not loud, but it had presence like a refrigerator in a quiet kitchen at 3 a.m. I crouched and put the mag light flat on the floor so the beam ran along the concrete under the staircase. Light catches things differently at that angle. The crack there widened into a small oval I'd never noticed because it reads as shadow when you look from above. The oval was a plugged hole filled with some kind of resin. A round impression around it glinted where resin met steel. The oval would be where a drain had once been. I thought of the foundation stone with Samuel Orr's name and the phrase people say about him still keeping his shift. And that annoyed me because this was a job site, not folklore. Then the radio on my belt said my name exactly the way I say it when I answer the phone. It was my voice. The word was breathy because it was traveling through rain and wet fabric. The next word, which I didn't recognize as mine, said, "Here." I said the thing you say when you're trying not to act like you heard your own voice. I said, "Go ahead." The radio clicked and went silent. I stood up too fast and my head hit the stair. The metal sounded sharp in my bones. I backed out and the hum stayed exactly where it was. I went upstairs because I didn't want to learn anything else in that room. At the top, I turned the key on the keypad like a habit and remembered it had no key and no power. My hands had learned a pretend motion to make my body feel better. The rain got finer and the fog thickened. It made the lamps brighter to look at and darker to stand in. Ed called on the radio and asked where I was. He sounded normal. I said mausoleum entrance. He said don't move. He sounded like he was staring at something and had decided that if he walked toward it, it would walk toward him faster. He came into view through the mist and I felt better and worse. His coat shoulders were darker than the rest of his coat, and his hair looked wet despite his cap. He tapped his lighter once with his glove and looked down at his hand like he didn't mean to. He said the outer gate looked wrong again, and that the chain had rubbed bright again where it couldn't have. Then he held something up between two fingers, the brass key with the chapel tag. He said, "This yours?" I said yes and asked where he found it. He said it was hanging from the bell rope by its ring. We both turned to look at the chapel even though we couldn't see it through the fog. He handed me the key. My glove was wet enough that the metal felt warm by comparison. He asked me to help him check the Morton plots again because he wanted to write something in the log and wanted me to agree. We walked together and the tower light made a slow arc and stopped like it was tracking, and then letting go. At the Morton plots, the soil along the edges looked tamped, which was impossible because nobody tamped anything since morning. He pointed to the aluminum tag. The zip tie was new, but not the brand we use. He said maybe a family member had replaced it. I said, "With what tags and ties?" He didn't answer. He seemed to be trying to set an example for himself of how to behave. We made a slow circuit along the outer road. The ditch water was higher, and we could hear it moving under the brush like someone breathing in heavy fabric. Ed said he hated this job some nights and then corrected himself and said he hated weather, not the job. He said that because he's the kind of man who thinks you shouldn't say you hate a place you're standing in, like it might take it personally. The radio on his belt gave a little single-note chirp that doesn't belong to any setting, and he slapped it without looking. The hour stretched. The bell rope hung still. The lantern in the shed stayed out. The tower light swung once and we didn't talk about it. I made coffee in the office and the smell cut the metallic air for about 60 seconds and then the air swallowed it. The logbook lay open and the page edges curled from damp. I drew a line under the last entry and wrote nothing. Around 3, the rain settled into a finer texture. The fog climbed up in sheets and then settled again like it was learning how to wear the stones. The tower light flickered, stuttered, and then made a slow, even sweep and back. That sweep isn't possible because there is no motor and no wind load, and I could stop listing reasons. Ed said he wanted to check the mausoleum one more time, mostly to prove something to himself. He didn't say what. He tapped the lighter twice on the desk without lighting it and left it there. We walked in silence. The sound of our boots on wet stone made a rhythm I still feel in my calves. The maglite beam picked up the drain at the bottom step, where water collects and refuses to go anywhere. The keypad was dark. We pulled the door, it opened. The interior smelled like wet coins. We stood at the top of the stairs and listened. I didn't want to ask him if he heard it because once you ask, the other person has to answer. He said he heard something like a line being held on a phone call. We went down to the landing. The light on the floor showed the oval in the resin under the first run. The hum lived in that corner the way a draft lives under a door. Ed crouched, hands on his knees, and the seams of his coat creaked. He said the hole was a former drain. He said it probably leads to a dry well. He touched a finger to the resin and didn't pull back. He said it was cold. He looked at me and asked me to hand him the Fiskar shovel that leans in the corner in case we drop something under a shelf. He didn't say why. I handed him the shovel. He put the edge of the steel gently along the seal line to test it. The sensation in my jaw increased like the note had found a better way to reach me. He saw something in my face and paused. I said not yet, and he nodded, as if to say he responsible for my yet. We stood there a long time with the rain in the background and the clink of water leaving the stair and hitting the landing, and the softer, irregular drip after that. The radio on my belt made that single chirp again that isn't real. Ed said he kept a stethoscope in his truck for engine noises and he wished it wasn't out at the outer road. We have rules about staying in after hours, but you can see the truck through the gate bars. He said he was going to go and come back, and he said it in a voice that made the room feel narrower. I said I'd stay here. He said don't go touching anything with a shovel until he got back because he wanted to feel useful. His boots made the sound you get when a boot leaves a floor with thin water on it, a seal breaking quietly over and over as he climbed. I waited with the mag light on the floor and the beam running under the first stair. My breath made visible steam that caught the light and then tattered. The hum lived down there the way an old fluorescent fixture hums even when it's off. I thought about pushing the shovel under the seam and popping it like a blister. I thought about lifting the resin plug and finding nothing, or finding a void that had been under the building since 1958. I thought about water running, because the cemetery has a way the water decides to go, and we all pretend we decide for it with our drains and swales. I thought about Samuel Orr's name and the way the letters on the foundation looked thin in the stone. The radio hissed and a voice said my name the way Ed says it. Then the voice said, "Don't touch it." I said copy and felt along my belt for the radio. It was there and it was quiet. The voice hadn't come from my radio. It had come from the stair. I stood because crouching made me feel like I was about to do something or be made to. The elevator doors upstairs in the chapel make a little gloss of sound when the heating system kicks on even though we don't have an elevator. I heard that sound and then I understood it was rain moving in a gutter. I tell you these details because I keep wanting to prove to myself that my brain went to regular explanations first, and every time, Ed didn't come back as fast as I wanted him to. I took the radio off my belt and thumbed transmit and said my position. The return hiss came with a hiss of rain. Then quietly, in a voice that was mine, the radio said, "I'm here." It took my body a second to realize my mouth hadn't moved. I turned the volume down and set the radio by the mag light on the floor. I heard the server rack sound, that little high whine, and then quiet. The scavenged air in that room felt thin and I became aware of my heartbeat through my ears. Ed came back with the stethoscope around his neck, the earpieces in. He had to keep one hand on the head to keep the rain from making false noise. He nodded like you do when you arrive and you're still moving. He crouched and set the stethoscope bell on the resin. His shoulders tightened. He moved the bell along the seam. He said he could hear something below, but not water. Not exactly. He said it was like a transformer buzz, but deeper and slower, the kind that rolls in your ribs. He said he wanted me to hold the maglite level and steady. I did. Then the stethoscope cord lifted a fraction the way a thread will when static takes an interest, and Ed took it off his ears and set it down. He tapped his lighter twice on his knee. I said we should call Connie. He said at 3 a.m. she won't hear the phone, and if she does, she'll tell us to lock up and go home. And we can't go home because this is our home right now. He said it like he was trying to make the idea sit still. He took the Fiskar's shovel and looked at me. I said do it, and I hate that I said that. He slid the shovel tip under the seam where the resin didn't make a perfect line, and applied pressure the way you ease a paint can lid. The first sound was a tacky pull like tape coming off a cold window. The hum deepened one notch like a step down on a staircase. He froze and leaned back. The resin didn't snap, it gave. The seam opened a hairline and a breath of air came up that felt colder than the room by several degrees. It had no smell. That is important. The lack of smell was a shape by itself. We heard a knock. Not a bell, a knock. Metal on metal from above. The bell rope in the chapel was hitting its housing. We both looked up, although there was only concrete and stairs. The knock came again and then stopped. The radio on the floor gave a chirp like a battery running down inside a smoke detector, and then stopped. The hum was still there, one notch deeper. Ed slid the shovel out and sat back on his heels. He rubbed his kneecap with his palm like it hurt. He said he wanted to put the resin back how it was. He said the air felt wrong. He pushed the seam together with the flat of the shovel blade, and the resin settled with a small sticky sound, and the hum moved back to its first notch. We both breathed like we had been waiting to be allowed to. He stood carefully and said we were going to go upstairs and write in the log that the mausoleum keypad had failed, and we'd secured the interior. He said it in the official way that makes the brain feel like it's putting the lids back on. We turned and went up. At the top, the metal handrail felt warm from our hands. The door moved like something had held it and let go. Rain hit the entry landing and made the floor look like oil. Back in the office, we stood under the buzzing fluorescent tubes. The logbook lay open where I'd left it. Ed took the pen and wrote the line he'd said he would. He wrote slowly and his hand didn't shake, and I watched the way his knuckles whitened when he pressed the letters. He set the pen down and angled it parallel to the edge again. I checked my watch and the hour hand had trouble finding numbers. The air tasted metallic, and the coffee in the styrofoam cup had cooled so much that the cup felt warmer than the liquid. Dawn in this place doesn't come in a rush. It finds the fog and diffuses. The lamps blinked off in their own time, not all at once. Marisol's truck lights showed as a glow at the outer road. She let herself in with her key because the padlock was on our side of the bars. She walked to the watch house with her hair in a scarf and wiped the moisture off her earmuffs with her sleeve. She said we looked like we hadn't slept. She hummed a bar of that tune she always hums, then stopped and asked if the trimmer was fueled because she wanted to hit the corner by the Pritchards before the family visit. Ed said yes, and then we both looked at each other because neither of us had fueled it. He went to the shed, came back and said the cap was on, the level was right, and the line was spooled perfect. Marisol laughed and said we had a helpful ghost. She doesn't believe in anything but work. False relief is a real thing. We did the checkouts we always do at shift change. The bell rope in the chapel was still. The outer gate chain looked wrong and we told ourselves it didn't. The tower light was off. The mausoleum keypad was dead, but the door was locked. We walked back to the watch house and the sun was a lighter patch of fog that made the stones show their edges. Marisol asked if we'd seen the newspaper article taped over the desk. It's an old one, yellowed, about the tower closing in 1958. Somebody had added a sticky note that says, "Call Donna about ladder safety talk." We said we had seen it. She wiped her glasses with the bottom of her shirt and left a news streak and said she'd fix it later. I went to sign the log for the end of night, which is a line and a time and a short description. My name was already there. My handwriting. The timestamp said 11:02 p.m. the night before, 6 hours before I'd arrived. The line read, "Mausoleum secured. Do not open." Ed looked over my shoulder and said my name in a tone that asked me to explain something I couldn't. I stared at the loop of the G and the way I crossed my T too hard and felt the same fatigue. I'd used to make that T. I turned the page stupidly like there would be a different version of reality there and saw a blank, lined sheet that had soaked up damp and rippled. We stood there a long time. The rain let up enough that the fog thinned, and for a second a slant of light touched the face of the mortuary wall. The tower lantern hung quiet. I walked to the mausoleum and stood 3 paces from the door, not any closer. I could hear it again, even in the morning, even with the wind moving the wet cedar near the fence and the drip from the gutter. It was quieter. It still lived where it lived, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The clanging started as soon as I swung the gate arm up. Not loud, just that repeated metallic chime, like a loose chain knocking the post. I thought it was the wind, but the air was hardly moving, heavy with the kind of drizzle that never settles into rain. I lifted my mag light to the watch house window and saw my own face first, pale in the glass, then the reflection of the sodium lamp behind me stretching into a yellow smear. I'm the night caretaker at Ridgeview Cemetery in the North End, and this was during my 6th month on the job. My name's Amir. I picked up the extra night shifts after Raffi moved on, and because Donnelly, the supervisor, said the budget could use a favor. If you've never been inside a cemetery at night, it's not what people imagine. The quiet isn't full of whispers or superstition. It's full of routine noises you learn and count on. Drip from the drainage spout at the chapel, The timer knock in the sodium lamps waking and going dim again. The click of the Motorola when you lean against your belt wrong. The slow release of air through the mausoleum's vent grates like a tired sigh. The drizzle makes everything ring differently. It brings out a metallic smell even in the grass. I signed into the logbook, same block printing I always use, 2158. Weather cold drizzle, lamp stable, grounds locked. Donnelly had underlined 2 things on the nightly checklist: patrol the mausoleum steps for water pooling, and check the chapel bell rope orientation. He's the type to underline instead of repeat himself. He taps a dented thermos against his clipboard when he wants you to hurry. The first pass is always the same. Walk the outer road where the hedge breaks and you can see headlights on the main street. Check the tool shed padlock. Cross to the chapel to make sure the vestibule light comes on. The steel trimmer hangs from 2 nails inside the shed, same as the Fisker's shovel, both still wet on their handles from the day crew's last use. I talk out loud sometimes to mark the quiet. Light stable, I say. Shit lucked. It keeps my breathing even. The drizzle collected on my jacket and the mag light beam had the grainy look it gets when the air's too wet. The first odd thing was the gate. I'd left it latched open for a delivery. Donnelly said a stone would arrive late for Monday's burial, and the driver might swing by after dark. Sorry, kid. I propped the arm with a chain and a cotter pin. On my second pass, the arm was back down and the chain had been wrapped twice. The cotter was pinched flat like it had been squeezed with pliers. I went through my pockets in case I'd mixed pins, but I only carry the brass ones Donnelly issues, not those cheap slotted clips. The asphalt at the hinge had new wet marks like someone stood there and dripped. It wasn't a big deal. People walk their dogs late and sometimes lift the arm, then drop it wrong. I raised it again, made a mental note. Inside the chapel, the vestibule light flickered once and steadied. The bell rope hangs down on the right, a thick hemp line that disappears into a carved oak hood. It's not used, not officially. The bell is dead weight, but the rope had a quarter twist in it, like someone had run it through their fingers while waiting. The twist made it swing just a few degrees, tick-tick against the wood. I straightened it. The chapel air was colder than outside and smelled like pennies. My boots left a wet trace along the aisle to the chancel where I checked the heater intake. The filter was clean. Back at the watch house, I poured coffee from Donnelly's thermos into a paper cup and checked the ledger that tracks interments. The pages are yellow even though they're new. He likes the sense of continuity, he says. Plot 7B interment of Edith Vale, scheduled Monday. Next line 4D, Thomas Calder, next week. Then a line that wasn't underlined, smaller writing at the top of the page as if added later. 12A, Nora Javid. The date penciled beside it was today's date, but in Donnelly's handwriting the year looked like last year's 4. He writes his 4s like houses. The graveyard files also have a plot map pinned to a corkboard. I checked. 12A was an old stone near the northern wall, a sandstone marker that flaked when you looked at it. Nora Javid had died in 1969. I stared at the pencil entry again. I rubbed at it and the year smudged but didn't vanish. The coffee taste turned brass in my mouth. Radio check at 22:15. That was habit from when Rafi was still around. He'd hum into the radio and say siren check as a joke, then hum some more. He had this way of tapping his lighter while he talked, a sharp little clack. With him gone, the only voice that answers is Carolyn from Municipal Security if she's not already dealing with somewhere busier. I keyed the Motorola and said, Caretaker Ridgeview, hourly check. It hissed for a long second and then I swear I heard my own voice come back faintly. The radio repeated the word check twice, soft like someone in another room said it. Then Carolyn came through, wind in her signal. Copy, Ridgeview. All quiet? I said yes and put the radio back. On the second sweep, there was damp soil between rows 9 and 10 that shouldn't have been damp. The drizzle wasn't heavy and the ground here is higher. The soil was darker in a rectangle about the size of a grave cut, but there was no fresh interment there, no boards, no flags. Pit-run gravel showed through the edges where someone had tamped it down. There were faint shoe marks, little semicircles, but they could have been mine from earlier. I stood still and listened. Drip from the chapel. Distant hiss of cars, the hum of the lamp ballast near the road. Then I picked up something like a tone you feel more than hear. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I walked toward the mausoleum, careful not to shine the light at any house behind the wall. The big doors were locked with a long throw bolt and the brass handles were chilly. The steps collect water. Donnelly gets on me for that. He says it causes freeze damage. I crouched and swept the beam along the join where the first riser meets the landing. Water had pooled in the right corner and gone still. A small stream of bubbles rose, broke, then rose again as if the stone was breathing. I told myself it was the drain doing what drains do. The humming was there, but when I put the light on the steps, it seemed to retreat into the stone. I felt the vibration in my kneecap through my jeans more than in my ear. Another anomaly. The outer gate to the service lane had been relocked from the outside. The mechanism simple, hasp and puck lock, but the puck was turned so the keyway faced the street, not inward like we always leave it. If a stray locked it fiddling around, they would have had to reach under and twist it that way. I wrote it down. Gate orientation reversed. The shed light refused to stay on. I hit the switch and the fluorescent snapped bright and then sagged to a nervous strobe. The Fisker's shovel blade had a new nick on it, bright fresh metal, not from a rock. The steel trimmer's fuel cap was finger tight, not the quarter-turn lock it should have. I tightened it. The smell in the shed was sawdust and wet oil. The rain on the roof ticked. I stepped back onto the gravel and the radio chirped on its own. A single squawk like someone keyed and released. The word that came through then was one word, not words at all, more like a syllable stretched thin. Open. I went into the chapel again to check the bell rope. It was swinging a bit more and had turned 2 full twists down its length. The vestibule light dimmed and came back. There's a small panel behind the coat hooks where the old fuse box lives. I opened it and found a brass key lying on the bottom lip of the cabinet. It wasn't ours. Our keys are stamped with numbers and have the county logo. This one was older and plain, heavy in my hand, the warding square and awkward. It was the kind of key you see in family Bibles, not in municipal buildings. I tried it in the chapel side door and the watch house cabinet for the radio. It didn't fit. I put it in my pocket because that was the safest place to put it, and also because leaving things where you find them is sometimes the worst choice. By midnight, the drizzle had thickened to a cold mist that glued my hair to my head. The timing on the lamps had a hiccup, and 3 on the eastern lane went out for a second and relit, making the rows of stones slow blink. I kept the beam low so it wouldn't chop the fog too much. A sound came from the far end like someone rapping knuckles on wood, steady and deliberate. When I got there, it was the sign at the outer wall, the rules plaque, moving just enough to tap the bricks with its corner in the wind coming over the top. I wedged it with a bit of folded program from the chapel. The wind died as soon as I did that. On the third pass, the ledger in the watch house had curled at the corners from the damp. Someone had left a page flagged with a paperclip I didn't know we owned. Where it was flagged, a note had been added in different handwriting than Donnelly's. A rounder hand. Bell check 112, no initials. The last log signed below that was from Rafi 2 months prior. He'd drawn a crooked smiley face next to his name the night before he quit. A one-eyed thing. I noticed then that his sign-off time and mine's sign-in time from tonight were the same minute on different days. It meant nothing. I had to keep it meaning nothing. The stone with the flaking surface, 12A, the Nora Javid stone, had a duplicate 4 rows over. Another stone with the same name, newer granite, same dates. I figured a family replaced the old stone and left the original. It happens. But the newer one had a small black mark near the base where a lawn flag had been. When I scraped it with my thumbnail, it came off like soot. The soil around the base had that dark dampness that wasn't quite puddling, as if it had been tamped after a shift. I checked the plot map in my head and realized 12A should not be here at all. This lane is 11. I went back to the watch house and pulled the corkboard down to be sure. The map's corner had dark spots where something wet had touched it. 3 evenly spaced dots like the end of a rope left prints. I replaced it carefully. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Around 1, Donnelly called. He never calls during the night shift unless I've left something undone. But he said he was doing his own rounds at a different site and wanted to make sure we still had our spare puck locks. People steal metal, he said, tapping the thermos by the tiny hollow sound that came through the line. He does that without knowing. I said both locks were accounted for and made a show for myself of opening and closing the shed to look. The brass key in my pocket felt hot against my leg. I told myself that was a story and not a fact. I thought about calling Rafi, then realized I didn't have his number anymore. He works days across town. He'd said he quit because night shifts make you see patterns where there aren't any. Then he cracked his lighter and said he meant that in both directions, whatever that means. The Motorola crackled again with that empty carrier sound. I set it on the watch house counter and the speaker vibrated with a tone. Then those same stretched syllables. Open. This time it was the exact pitch of the humming at the mausoleum. At 1:12 on the dot, because the flagged note had gotten into my head. I went to the chapel, then the mausoleum, then back to the chapel. The bell rope had rotated and now the frayed tassel at the bottom touched the floor, leaving a darker crescent on the stone. When I put my hand on the rope, the twist unwound all at once with a soft sigh like hair untwisting. I let go too fast and my palm burned. The vestibule light winked, then steadied. I peered into the oak hood with the mag light and saw nothing but a dark shaft and the faint suggestion of a pulley. No cobweb swinging, no draft. I made the deep sweep then, the one down through the tight older rows where the ground is uneven and the markers lean on each other like drunks. The drizzle had turned to a heavier wetness. My jacket had gone from soaked to clinging. The lamplight at this depth was weak. The fog ate it. I could hear water collecting in the small drain near the mausoleum, and a sound like someone wearing corduroy trying to move quietly. I told myself it was the wet grass rubbing my pant legs. The steps to the mausoleum shone and the pooled water in the right corner had grown. Bubbles came more steadily and I could make out a seam in the stone I didn't know was there, a hairline across the landing. I took the brass key out then and felt stupid for doing it like I was answering a dare. I pressed its square end along the seam. It snagged near the riser, and when I pushed down I felt it land in a notch. It wasn't a lock, not in any standard sense, but there was something manufactured about the notch. The humming grew slightly. The air pressed on my ears like a plane landing. This was the point where I should have called Donnelly or Carolyn. I didn't. I test my own compromises first, and then I tell someone. It's not smart, but it's honest. The bubbles stopped. The water lowered as if pulled from below. I saw then that the rightmost riser wasn't fixed. It flexed inward a quarter inch. A catch, then it reset. I pressed the key-shaped thing again and this time held it while I slid the maglite beam into the corner. The beam picked up a metal grate under the lip, black and old with a single small brass plate next to it. The plate had been painted over and wasn't legible. The key, when I pushed, made the grate tilt. Just a hair. There was a soft rush of air that smelled like old stone, and the inside of a drained fountain. I used the Fiskar shovel then, held sideways as a lever and eased the grate up enough to see a dark cavity beneath the steps like a crawl space. The humming was down there, steady and faint. I snapped a fresh angle with the maglite and saw a second brass key lying on the ledge inside the cavity, older than the one in my pocket, corroded to a green-black. Its ring stuck to the stone by a skin of mineral. Beside the key lay a folded paper so damp it looked like skin. My name was on it. I didn't pull the paper out, not then. My hand shook too much, and also I was aware in a very practical way of how stupid it would be to drop my flashlight, or the key into that hole. I felt the grate's weight wanting to fall. The steel trimmer was still in the shed with a strap. I thought I could fish the paper out with the strap loop if I needed to. I let the grate down gently and the humming softened. I put the key back in my pocket. I wrote in the notebook, step cavity, possible drain access. Item inside, to address in daylight. Then I left that scene exactly like that, and the leaving felt like retreating from something you've offered your name to. At 2 Kausinalrides, the lamps hiccuped again. The 3 on the east road went out and came back twice. A car idled on the other side of the northern wall and then drove off. I checked the service lane gate, and it was still wrong side oriented. The drizzle stopped briefly. The air inside the chapel felt warmer, and smelled faintly of wood smoke now, which made no sense. The bell rope hung straight, no twist. But when I reached the vestibule door, it didn't push open like before. It resisted, then gave in a little. Something was against it. I pushed harder and it moved, and the resistance dissolved like it was only ever in my mind. Inside, a small trail of wet footprints led from the threshold halfway down the aisle and then stopped. Size 9 maybe. Mine. Except I hadn't walked that exact line. My route, I checked, had wandered more toward the left. The radio crawled with static. The word that came through was not open this time, but a breathy repetition of a single consonant. It stretched and became a long hiss. I turned the volume down. The maglight's beam jittered as my hand did. In that quiet I heard again, behind the wall now and not in the radio, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I've been trying to be clear about the sequence because it helps me not dramatize it. Around 2:20, the noise from the steps resolved into something like a pitch that oscillates, the kind of tone you get when two machines are slightly out of tune with each other. I took the Fiskars and the steel strap and went back. The drizzle had returned. My breath made thin ribbons in the air. The maglite was slick. I changed my grip. When I knelt, the cold went through my pants and into my skin in a clean line. The brass key fit the notch again. I levered, lifted the grate 2 fingers breadth, and looped the style strap in under to catch the paper. It's a dumb tool for a delicate job. The hook slipped. I swore at a normal volume because anything louder would have felt like an announcement. I adjusted the strap, snagged the corner of the damp paper, and eased it toward me. It tore. A triangle of it came away. On the bit I got, my name was there in my handwriting, the same block letters I use in the ledger. Below my name were 4 numbers I recognize as radio codes: 10 to 97 on scene, 10-8 in service. Those were Rafi's favorites to say out loud. The paper had a waterline stain across the top in the shape of a stepped edge. I tried again with the strap. A small piece of grit fell into the cavity and hit whatever floor was down there with a sound like tapping a glass. The humming changed pitch by a hair, not louder, closer. The practical danger hit me then. Not a haunted kind. A physical kind. I had a heavy grate propped open. Cold, wet hands, and I was leaning over a void I did not fully understand. If the grate slipped and slammed, my fingers could be right where metal wants to meet stone. I wedged the Fiskar's handle under the lip to act as a stop. I fed the strap back to the paper and tugged. It slid this time onto the ledge. The second brass key shifted and hit the ledge with a tiny, bright sound. Something moved below. I don't mean a figure. I mean the air moved around my ankles as if drawn. The radio, set on the step to my left, clicked and let out a tone perfectly matched to the hum below. Then it spoke in a voice that was mine, the recording of my earlier check, Caretaker Ridgeview hourly check. Hearing my own words come up from beneath the stone while the radio sat in the rain beside me, played with distances in a way I can't explain. The maglite beam found that folded paper now fully on the ledge. I reached and pinched it between 2 fingers. I pulled it out, slow to keep from tearing it. When it came free, water came with it. Not much, but enough to make a dark line on the step. I didn't open the paper immediately. I needed the grate down first. I slid the Fiskar's handle out, took the weight, lowered the grate. The brass plate clicked faintly as it seated. The humming softened to what it had been before. I opened the paper with the maglite pinched in my elbow and read it in the rain because I didn't want to take it into any building. It was a page from our logbook, or made to look exactly like one. The lines were the same. The little watermark in the corner was the county crest. The way the graphite holds on that paper was the same. The entry at the top was mine, my name. The time, 02:30. The note, check bell rope, check gate, check steps. Then a second entry below that, in the rounder hand I'd seen before. Bell check 112, then open, no signature. The page number was 53. The ledger on the counter in the watch house was on page 48. I took the paper to the watch house anyway. I set it next to the ledger and compared page lines. Same. I turned the ledger pages slowly despite my wet hands. Page 49, 50, 51, 52 blank. Page 53 had the same entries as the damp paper, except the upper time said 03:30, not 02:30, and the second line was not there. I turned back to page 47 and 48, and my earlier log in my handwriting looked normal. I checked the corner watermark. The damp page had the crest reversed, a print error you only see if you made a run twice and flipped the plate. The coffee I hadn't finished was cold and slick on my tongue. The humming in my bones had faded. I wanted it back so I could say it was constant. I went out again. The bell rope hung straight. I took it in my hand and it was warm. The bell itself is supported by a beam in a tower you have to reach by a ladder behind a locked door. That door was locked. The brass key did not fit it. It didn't fit the watch house cabinet or the service lane lock. It fit only the niche notch in the step that doesn't exist on any blueprint I've seen. My boots left new wet prints and joined the others, and again they matched mine more than not. The shed fluorescent had finally given up. The steel trimmer smelled like fuel even with the cap tight. The Fiskar's handle had a dull scrape along it where the grate had slid. The fog thickened so the lamps became halos and the parts of the cemetery furthest from me withdrew into simple shapes. What pushed it from strange into wrong was the sound under the steps becoming a syllable. That's the moment. The hum modulated into something that had edges like a vowel said without a mouth. I felt the steps like a throat. It made me want to step away and also to press my ear to the stone. I knelt again and my knees hurt with the cold. I did not open the grate. I listened. The drizzle made a quiet static around me. Somewhere in the grounds, a drainage pipe clucked as air moved. The hum became a fraction louder and focused itself under my right foot. Panic came in the way your chest tightens without speeding your thoughts. I wasn't afraid of the dead. I was afraid of the machine that wasn't a machine under the steps that knew where my foot was. What do you do then? The honest answer is you back away. I took 3 small steps backward, keeping the mag light on the corner where the water had pooled and was now immediately draining into itself, forming a funnel around a plugged point. The radio on my hip clicked. A carrier tone, then a word in the same mechanical way, arranged from the noise of my earlier words. Open. I answered in a normal voice to nobody. No. My voice sounded like someone else's. The lamps held. The air felt like wet linen on my face. I caught the bell rope in my mind as a tether point. Something to look at later, and then I did the most boring thing I could. I wrote the details in the ledger. Time, temperature by feel, lamp condition, tool conditions, location of the brass key. It kept my hand steady. The page drank the water from the damp paper and wrinkled. It didn't relent exactly. At 3:12, the vestibule light went dark and bright and stayed bright. At 3:14, the service lane gate arm was down again with the chain clipped and the pin flattened further. At 3:20, the chapel bell gave a single low note even though the rope hung still. The note carried in the fog like a truck horn far away. I went into the chapel and stood at the back, not touching anything. My breath made a small cloud. The pews had a faint sheen of moisture. Rafi used to hum here. He said the acoustics made even a bad hum sound like a song. I heard the hum like a note held. I heard my own name as a shape inside it. I stood there for 5 minutes and counted the small creaks the building makes. The radio stayed quiet. Around 3:40, my jaw hurt from clenching. I unlocked the shed and took an old canvas tarp and wrapped it around the steel strap to dry it. The tarp had a chalk mark across it, a number, 12A. It wasn't like chalk lines the day crew uses to mark lengths. It was like someone had written a label on the tarp itself long ago. The drizzle slackened until the fog just hung. I walked back up the lane to the watch house, intending to sit down for the 15 minutes before another sweep, and found the ledger open to page 53 again, even though I had closed it. Another entry had appeared. Rafi's handwriting. 10:97, that was it. No time, no date. I took a photo with my phone and it showed on the screen, but when I looked again, the line was thinning like graphite dissolving. I glanced at the window. My reflection didn't line up with the yellow smear of the lamp behind me anymore. It was a half step to the left. I moved my head and it caught up. The audible part of my fear came in as a taste this time, copper behind the tongue. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I went out. The lamps along the main path held steady. The chapel wore its quiet like a coat. The steps to the mausoleum were wet and glossy and still. The hum had softened to a ghost of itself, but when I put my foot on the first riser, I felt it come up through the bone. The brass key was heavier than it had any right to be. I pressed it into the notch and held it without lifting the grate. The pitch changed like I'd drawn a bow across a string. Then it stopped. The air felt empty for the first time all night. I took my hand off the key and the hum did not return. I stood very still and counted to 100. Nothing. The drain in the right corner was quiet. I could hear a drip in the distance from the chapel spout. A bird in a pine tree shook itself and I heard the water come off it. Dawn here is a slow gray before the lamps click out. The sodium light seems to notice the change before your eyes do. The fog loses edges and becomes just air. I made what I think of now as my mistake. I believed it was over. I walked the outer road and the tools were where I'd left them. The shed locked. The bell rope not moving. The service gate arm up. My boots printed only where my boots went. The drizzle quit. The watch house smelled like old coffee and wet paper. I signed out. I wrote no incidents requiring report because I wanted that sentence to be true. Donnelly's underlines look ridiculous in daylight, by the way. The thermos dent shines more. He came in early and nodded at my notes and said good in his flat way. He tapped the thermos and told me to go home and actually sleep. He does this thing with his glasses where he takes them off and wipes the lenses with his shirt while still looking at you. All soft focus. He did that and said, "You look like a ghost." I said, "I feel fine." I walked to the gate and lifted the arm and chained it so the stone truck could come. I turned back once at the mausoleum because of course I did. It looked like a building looks solid boring. I went home and slept badly. This is the part that ruins the relief. In the afternoon, because the page had bothered me, I drove back to the cemetery with the sun out and the drizzle gone. Donnelly teased me about taking my work too seriously. The lamps were off, the fog was burnt away, the grass looked clean. I went into the watch house to look at the ledger again, to prove to myself that damp paper and page 53 and my name at odd times were tricks of a tired brain. The ledger was there. The bookmark Donnelly uses, an old funeral program, stuck out at page 44. I flipped to where my entry should be. My signature was already there on page 53, but the time wasn't 02:30 or 03:30. It was 04:45. I had left at 04:10. Below my line was a second line in the rounder hand. Gate relocked. Rope reset. Steps drained. I walked out of the watch house and went straight to the mausoleum and set my foot lightly on the first riser. The stone was warm as skin, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing that cut through the drizzle was panting behind me, close enough that I stepped aside without thinking, like to make room for a body I didn't want to bump. The path was slick and the sodium lamps threw that drowsy orange that makes your eyes grainy, and for a second I saw a shadow tilt at my heels and thought, good, he's back. The dog is back. Then my flashlight showed only fog snagged on the yew-hedge and the wet stone of the watch house door. I'm the night caretaker at Clayton Grove Cemetery in the South End, and this happened during my last week on the job, the week I finally stopped, telling the new hires that the panting is just wind. The watch house is a brick box built in 1903. The radiator ticks in the window gasket is half gone, so cold creeps up your cuffs no matter what. I signed the log at 9:57 p.m., dipped the pen back in the cracked ceramic well out of habit, and left a line of water across the page with my sleeve. Tom Hale had scrawled the last note before mine. Southgate relocked 1710. Ask Rosa about key. Rosa Alvarez is our groundskeeper for weekdays. She wipes her glasses when she thinks you're lying and keeps every key on a loop that she refuses to wear, because she says if you wear keys, you forget what they're for. She'd left at 5, shook her head at the drizzle and told me, if you hear pacing, it's him. She never calls it the dog. She looks toward the black section, row J, where the old headstones lean toward each other like tired neighbors, and she doesn't say dog because saying dog makes it too easy to shrug. The radio on the shelf came to life as I zipped my coat. Motorola, old tan plastic, the kind you have to baby because the battery tastes yard dust. I test the signal by clicking the thumb bar twice. On the second click, I heard static make a shape, the way a hand makes a shape against frosted glass. It formed a breath and a word I couldn't catch, then it settled back into hiss. I told myself it was the municipal repeater in the park next door. The drizzle turned to that fine rain that gets under your collar and down your spine. I took the mag light, tucked a Fiskars shovel under my arm for balance on the hill, and smelled the metal. Everything smelled like metal that night, even the wet grass. My first walk is to the outer gate road and the caretaker shed by the north wall. The lamps hum. The patter off the leaves is soft, and when the fog drifts between the lamps, you can feel the air lose a degree. I stopped to push on the south gate even though Tom had relocked it. It held. When I turned, the chain hung loose for a second and then settled like someone had been holding it on the far side. I waited, held my breath, counted, and the only answer was rain tapping on the chain links. The shed smelled like fuel and damp paper. The shelves are lined with labeled bins, stencil painted in Hale's block capitals, twine, crepe, vases, flags. I checked the steel trimmer and the gas cans, logged it in the clipboard hung by a nail. The clipboard was flipped to a page torn from the top of an old ledger, the kind with green lines and a red margin. Someone had written a column of names from the Northfield burials dating back 30 years. In the middle of the list, twice 4 lines apart, was Edwin Pike. I ran my finger over the ink. Same hand, same pen pressure, same slant. I told myself we'd had a son and a father with the same name, or a cousin. But Rosa's habit raised up in me, and I found myself wiping my face with my sleeve, the way she wipes her glasses when she's not buying a story. By the chapel, a sodium lamp was stuttering. The light swings on a lazy cycle when it's wet. The ballast complaining, but this was a steady 5 counts bright, 3 counts dim, like breathing. I stood under it and let the dimness wash me and listened for soil settling. That little puck of sound when water finds a fresh pocket. The chapel door latch has an old iron bell rope tied to it from a time when you could pull from outside to call someone out of the watch house. The rope swung when the dim hit. I held it still. When I let go, it moved again. 1/2 inch, not enough to blame on a draft in that air. And the motion was the motion of something letting go. Behind the chapel is the lower path to the West Mausoleum. The stone steps there are worn thin on the edge where groundskeepers go up with trimmers and ladders. As I put my foot on the first riser, I heard it for the first time that night. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I was far still 50 yards, but the sound traveled through wet ground, like the way you feel a bus before you hear it. I stopped, tried to blame a transformer in the utility yard across the street, but the hum was under my boot. Not in the air, under I checked the map in my coat pocket. It's a folded plot map papered in pencil ticks from 50 years of burials, the kind that you can feel with your finger, where a hand pressed hard to finish a note in rain. In Section C near the West Mausoleum, there's a row that never drains right. Rosa calls it the sponge. The ground there was damp, though the sky hadn't opened yet, and a ridge of fresh soil at plot C19 had slumped toward the path, even though nobody was scheduled there for the week. The ledger said C19 is Crowley, Agnes, and I remember her funeral because her niece left carnations on the wet steps, and a black dog lay just out of the awning. Head on paws, eyes on the box the whole time. He belonged to her in life. The family told us his name was Nye. He hung around after, 3 years by my count, sleeping under the iron bench in rain and heat, until one March he didn't get up. Tom used a Fisker's shovel like the one I carried to cut a square by the edge of Agnes's stone, and buried the dog there with his brass tag because the family asked. He tamped it gently and didn't sign the ledger that night. Something scraped the inside of the chapel while I stood staring at the slumped soil. I walked back and checked the door again. The key turned in the lock, but the door didn't give. The key was Rosa's copy, a brass one worn almost smooth with the numbers stamped shallow. It's never failed me. I went through my ring, found the iron one that fits only the older mausoleum, a piece of metal nobody has a duplicate of. It didn't fit the chapel, it shouldn't have, but the teeth met and held and turned a 1/4 inch like it wanted to decide who it was. I took it out like it was a mouth. By 10:30, the rain softened into a mist that you have to see with a beam or it doesn't exist. I swung the mag light across stones because the fog makes you unsure where the ground ends. On 3 stones in a row, I saw the name Pike again. Not all Edwin, but the surname in the same form. Same shape of the E. It was probably my head. Probably the way familiarity drags your eye to patterns. But the same nicks in the serif made my thumb worry at the light's rubber switch. A crow called once from somewhere up in the U's and then shut up, like it remembered the hour. I made the rounds. The caretaker shed door was shut. The south gate chain hung again in a way that said someone had just taken their hand away. The radio whispered and then cleared its throat twice. When it spoke my name, Ben, the way people who don't know me always say it, like it's the first word of a question. I clicked back. Tom, is that you? Only the hum of the lamps answered until Rain found a metal lid somewhere and ran a tapping rhythm that matched my pulse for a few steps, and then jagged away. At 11, I stopped in the watch house to warm my hands over the radiator. The logbook lay open where I'd left it, but my entry had a wet thumbprint on the margin that wasn't mine. The thumbprint was too low if you imagine someone standing. It matched the height of a hand held by a kneeling person, or a hand set on the table by someone tired. I went to the map cabinet because maps calm me. I pulled an old plot chart, the one from 1951 that still has clay on the folds. A brass key fell out small, weighty, a little offset in the bit with a loop-stamped bell. I called it the bell key because the chapel had a bell we never used and the rope was more habit than function. The key was warm, too warm for the room. I set it on the logbook. The page underneath began to spot with circles of moisture where the head of the key touched. I didn't like that, and I told myself it was from my sleeves. Around midnight, I heard Rosa's presence in my head the way you do when you're alone, and you borrow someone else's sanity as a tool. Her habit of wiping her glasses. Her way of saying no without sound and looking past you at the ground. I went back to the West Mausoleum because you go toward what you're afraid of or you never leave. The steps were slick. The hum was there again, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, closer now like a voice humming through teeth. I put my hand on the stone rail. The stone was vibrating very lightly. Rain ticked off the ironwork on the windows, and under that a kind of breath. It wasn't a generator. We don't keep anything powered under there aside from a sensor that pings if someone opens the iron gate at the far end. And even that is a dry click in a small box. I tried the brass bell key in the mausoleum door out of spite. It shouldn't have fit, which felt safer to prove, but the key moved in the lock like it had known the shape once and forgotten it. It didn't turn. It didn't refuse. I felt a minor heat in the handle. I took my hand away and the cold came back in. I told myself I was angry because that's easier than afraid, and I told the air, no games. After one, the small things accumulated the way puddles join into sheets. A wreath on Mellor's stone had rotated 90 degrees with no wind. The lantern by the outer gate went out twice even after I changed the bulb. My boot print on the sponge row filled with water from below and gleamed like an eye. In the caretaker's shed, the Fisker's shovel from the wall rack had a smear on the blade like clay, even though everything under the eaves stays dusty until a hand drags the dust away. In the chapel window, I saw a shadow that read as a dog at a glance because it was low and patient, and when I moved the beam it became the pew arm and the music stand together. The radio woke up again around 2 and found a word to say twice that didn't belong to me. It said here. I clicked and said where, and it said here once more. Radio static doesn't repeat like that without another voice. I hit the beam on the bell rope because it looked like a muscle in the low light, and I noted without drama that the rope's end was wet higher than where rain would reach. It would take a hand to wet it there. I held my palm to the rope and came away with that same metallic smell, clean and inside the nose. In the distance, a car made a sound like a wave and then was gone. The cemetery took the quiet back like a habit. At 3, cold finds every seam. Your jaw goes tired from clenching. That's the hour I always know if the night is going to show its hands. I stood in the west field and watched breath leave me and disappear before the lamp reach. I thought of the story Rosa told me my first week. There was a black dog who would not leave after his person died. He did a lap every hour and then slept by her stone. Tom let him. He emptied his thermos for him in winter when bowls froze. When the dog died, Tom buried him in the same row because he couldn't stand putting a friend in the landfill. He put the brass tag in with him and wrote the date in pencil in the corner of the plot map, because he knew he wasn't supposed to write it in the ledger. He said what shut him up was that on the next 2 first nights for new watchmen, they all turned around at the same spot on the path like someone was there, and each one described feeling a tail brush their calves at least once. He didn't tell them until afterward. I always told myself that once you expect a thing like that, your body learns to deliver it. When the hum changed, I felt it in my teeth. It was closer, and my foot on the step made the hum step too. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, deeper now, like the sound is under your ribs, like it wants to measure your breath and match it. I raised the mag light and the beam made the wet air glow. The stone plaque by the door had sprouted a line of tiny snails I hadn't seen earlier, each reflecting a dot of the lamp like a string of eyes. I told myself that was just snails. I told myself the earth moves and water finds its way. I set the shovel down against the rail because that's the kind of thing you write later. I took the bell key and pressed it to the lock. I expected heat. I got a cool click like a glass bead. The tumblers didn't turn. The click ran away under the stone the way a drop of water runs through a drain. At my back, I heard the faint sound of paws on stone. Nothing touched me. I stood a second longer than I wanted, and then I went inside the chapel where there's a light and a bench. The chapel's air holds the smell of wet hymnals and iron. The candle box at the front holds battery candles we use at memorials. One was on. Those things don't come on by themselves. I checked the switch and found it set to off. I clicked it on and the light went out. Then I clicked it off and it lit again. I left it. On the lectern lay a single folded page from the burial ledger. It was a copy of the week's schedule, the one we leave for the priest when he does a blessing. The date at the top was 2 days ahead. My name was signed at the bottom, confirming the grounds ready for a service at 5 a.m. My signature looked like mine after a night without sleep. The service was for Alvarez Rosa. Under it, someone had added in pencil, small, along the margin that not even the priest would read, "With dog." I picked it up, and the paper stuck to the lectern. The wood felt damp, though the candles had not been real in years. Outside again, the fog had shifted to a steady, thin rain that made little sound on the grass but hissed on stone. The lamps hummed constant. The hum under the mausoleum steps stayed. I decided to do the stupid thing because sometimes doing the stupid thing is the only way to feel like you chose it. I pulled the iron gate across the back of the mausoleum, the one that guards the steps that go down to the utility crawl. The padlock there has a shape I know like my own teeth. I set the bell key to it because I was now pretending the key belonged to everything. The lock opened like it had expected me. There was the smell of wet chalk and rust. My light showed the top of the steps, rough stone on either side, and darkness that swallowed the beam by the third step. It's not a depth thing. It's water in the air. I went down 3 steps and stopped because the hum was different below. Up top it had been in the stone. Below it was in the air at knee height like a voice in a mouth. I crouched and held the beam low. On the third riser, someone had scratched a long mark across the stone face like you'd mark a height for a child. And at the end of the mark was a circle drawn with a nail and filled with something dark that water couldn't dissolve. It looked like a stamp left by the head of a small key. I set the bell key against it because that is how your brain gets when it is late. The metal kissed the stone and I felt a vibration in the key, not the step. The radio hissed on my belt and said my name in a breath between rustles. The shovel knocked once against the rail above as if adjusting its balance and stayed where it leaned. I said, "Nye," because I believe in saying the name you want. The hum paused like a chest pauses at the end of a breath. There was breathing in the sound. Not a human pattern, not dog either. A rhythm that matched the kind of sleep where nothing changes for a long time. I heard a soft brush behind me at calf height, a movement across wet pant leg that was warmth moving past. I did not turn because every story that goes bad starts with a turn at the wrong time. I said, "I'm sorry," and felt foolish immediately because who was I talking to? A dog who did not understand apologies. A stone that held other people's grief. I backed up into the rain and let the key hang in my fingers. The hum followed at the same volume. It was not in the steps anymore. It was in the air around my hand. I closed my fingers and the hum sharpened like a tuning fork when you tighten your grip. In the beam, the key looked like a piece of a bell would look if you cut it right where the note lives. The climax of it didn't look like anyone would think. There was no shape stepping out of fog, no white dress in the chapel, no man at the gate. It was the way the whole cemetery held its breath at once. The lamps did not flicker, which I only realized because I was waiting for them to. The rain sound flattened. The wind disappeared because there had not been wind to begin with. The radio clicked and said "here" in a voice I knew this time, Tom's, but filtered through distance. I said, "Where is here?" And the answer came as a pressure on my right calf, then left like something pacing me just out of step, the way Nye used to do when I brought him water. I kept the shovel in my left hand and the key in the right, and went with it, down the row of pike stones and past Crowley, Agnes, and stopped at the square in the sponge where Tom had set a friend years ago. The soil was level. It should have been. A wet print the size of my hand appeared at the corner like something exhaled there. I wiped the rain out of my eyes and shivered, hard enough that the beam shook and the stuttering lamp near the chapel seemed to copy the shake. My breath fogged. My mouth tasted coins. I set the shovel tip in the ground because I needed a third point of contact. I tucked the bell key into my palm and it fit so exactly it felt like it had been waiting for my hand and not any hand. The radio went to white hiss and then found a low band, not city dispatch, not maintenance, something else. And in that band came a steady behind noise hum that matched the one under my ribs. It grew until I could feel the sound in my eardrum without hearing it with my ear. The bell rope on the chapel moved by 1 inch and stopped, and in that movement was a weight, the kind that comes from below when something leans up. What happened then still makes me careful with tense. I am there again as I tell it. There was a touch that was not human, and not anything else I have the right name for. It did not push or pull. It established. It made its shape around the lower half of my legs the way fog makes its shape around your ankles. Only warm. The radio hissed and the word "stay" arrived not as a command but as a shape smoothed into my head. And I recognized it as the one word a dog learns first, that is about distance. I set the shovel down and crouched because everything in me told me not to stand tall above something that wanted me near. Rain soaked through the knees. My breath made 2 small ghosts, and then none at all when the hum met it. I held the key and thought of Rosa's name on the page with the wrong date, and felt a little rage because whatever thought it had a right to her had to get through me first. The steps of the mausoleum sang then, not a tune, just a resonance that happens when a truck passes and your cupboard whispers. The hum chased that resonance up and down and found a pitch that made the key in my hand vibrate. I knew the physics well enough. Bells ring because energy hits a material that wants to move in a certain way. The key wanted. Something called it. The call did not come from the door. It came from the ground at the corner of Agnes Crowley's plot, right where Tom had tamped with the back of a shovel and wiped his eyes after coughing too hard to pretend it was the cold. The shovel lifted by an inch and fell back, metal edge ticking stone. No hand held it. Water found a seam and ran in a rivulet toward the path that wasn't the lowest grade. The bell rope brushed the chapel door. The radio cut from hiss to silence as clean as a blade. The hum settled into a single note that didn't get louder, but stretched until it didn't need volume to exist. In that note, I heard footsteps that were always half a pace behind, and the way claws scritch once and then stop because a paw lifts. I set the key against the soil at the corner and the tone softened like layered cloth. The pressure around my calves lifted. The warm air moved forward by the span of a bent knee, to the exact spot where Rosa's penciled note had said "with dog," as if to confirm the grammar of the world. I did not bury the key and I did not pocket it. I set it on the grass with the loop toward the stone. The rain made it shine a dull gold. It looked older than it had in the watch house. It looked like the loop had once held a tag. I spoke as quiet as I could without whispering because whispers make it worse. I said, "Okay." I said, "He stays." I said, "But not the girl." I meant Rosa in the ledger, the wrong date, the wet thumbprint. A sound like a soft exhale left the ground, low and brief. It ran through the stone's base and up my hands resting on my knees. The hum under the steps receded not even a yard, just enough to tell me that my body could move without raising it again. I stayed there until the next hour started. The lamps did not flicker. The rain never really changed. The radio did not speak again. The key lay where it lay. At some point I realized my pant legs were steaming where heat met cold air, a thin ribbon that twined and vanished. When I stood, my knees recorded a protest that will outlast the job. I lifted the shovel and hung it back on the shed rack. I walked the path and felt nothing at my heels. Only once did I feel the brush of a tail against my calf, and that was when I passed the bell rope. It tapped my leg like a playful thing. I didn't smile. Dawn at Clayton Grove is not sunrise so much as the sodium lamps admit the world back in. The sky lightened to the color of paper with water spots. Birds started in the U's one by one like someone testing a defective speaker. The watch house window fogged from the inside because of my breath and the radiator's effort. I signed the log at 5:58 a.m. because I couldn't wait 2 minutes to make it look cleaner. I went to my truck to change into dry socks and stopped because I realized all at once that I had not stepped outside the gates all night, and the gate chain hung flat, no memory of a hand. False relief is a thing you can locate. Mine was at the desk with the log and the key. The key was where I left it on the bench in my head, by the Crowley stone. It was not on the desk. The bell loop on my palm had pressed a faint line like a ring for a marriage you might think you misremembered. I told myself I had imagined leaving it by the plot, that I had carried it back and set it down and not looked. I pulled open the log to write a note to ask Rosa if she'd seen it, because she saves me from my own forgetfulness more than I admit. The log lay open to a blank page. At the bottom, an inch above the line, sat a faint watermark in the shape of a loop and a bit. The kind a brass key would leave if you set it there wet and left it long enough to dry. The date at the top was correct. The time stamped by the punch clock across the room read 5:57, a minute before my pen had made the mark I remembered making. For a second, the room seemed to inhale. I heard through the wall the hum I had decided had gone. I went back to the West Mausoleum with my socks still wet and the lamps shutting off one at a time. The steps looked like any other morning after a rain. Small snail tracks on the low stones, moss bright as a bruise. I stopped on the second riser and felt it again. Not loud, not intrusive, but present. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The chain on the east gate was already clipped the first time I heard it, a wet metal vibration that flattened into the fog like a held breath. The drizzle made the gravel stick to my boots and my mag light quivered because my hand did. The new sodium lamps we'd put in along the main path pulsed and then steadied in that orange way that makes everything look bruised. By the time I got the gate relocked and radioed the watch house, the sound had settled back into the stones. I'm the night caretaker at St. Bartholomew Cemetery outside the city, and this was during my final week of nights before moving to daytime schedule. I took the job after my father passed. It seemed fair to take a place where the quiet is at least honest. The place is older than people think, with a watch house that still smells like pipe tobacco, and a tiny chapel where a string pulls a bell that nobody rings anymore. There's a brick mausoleum down the center line that looks newer than it is, because the stone takes rain differently than the old graves. I learned every path by the way the fog sticks in different layers and how the drizzle collects on the iron fences before dropping in slow taps. My supervisor, Mrs. D'Souza, writes in a small square hand in the logbook and wipes her glasses when she's thinking. Rafik, my only regular night partner, taps his lighter against his knuckles when he's bored and pretends he's not counting the hours. I keep the keys on a brass ring in my right pocket, because when they swing against my thigh, I feel less alone. The first off note wasn't dramatic. A burial record I'd copied from the funeral home noted January 13th for a Mrs. Salma Bano, but the stone that arrived said January 31st. That happens with orders sometimes, so I penciled a question mark in the margin and left a sticky for the day clerk. Later, the day clerk insisted the family approved the 13th. Mrs. D'Souza shrugged and wiped her glasses. The drizzle increased and the old gravel absorbed it like breath. Tiny things like that are how unease starts. It never announces itself in words you can write. Down that night, the lantern by the chapel door wouldn't stay lit. It's an electric lamp with a frosted panel and it flickered, stubborn as if the bulb itself were cold and didn't want the work. I checked the breaker, watched the glow steady for a minute, then walked away and it went out again. The wind wasn't right to move the bell rope, but when I looked up, the rope was swaying a few inches like someone had let go of it. I put my hand on it to stop it and felt, for a long blank second, warmth that didn't belong to me. On my next sweep, the gate I had locked at the outer road showed clean, latched teeth like it had never been cut. The chain lay in a coil near the fence, bright where the drizzle had wiped dust off the links. I sent a message on the Motorola to Rafik. He came in from the tool shed with his lighter tapping. "Kid," he said, like that covered every kind of problem. We walked to the watch house to write it down. The watch house has a ledger with lines like track marks. I wrote the incident at a 1:40 and turned the page for a clean start. The same entry was already there in my handwriting, time-stamped 0020. Rafik watched me look at it. He didn't joke. He wiped the lighter flame along the page margin as if heat would reveal a trick. If I put my ear to the mausoleum steps when the fog is thick, I can almost always hear water carrying the sound of the drain, a hard-working cough deep somewhere. It's not mysterious. Stone holds noise like that. But just before 3 that night, when the drizzle had slowed to a mist and the sodium lamps looked like planets trembling over mud, I paused on the lower step and heard something that wasn't water. It was a low, even vibration, like a generator heard through a wall. The phrase formed itself in my head, plain and uninvited. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. A practical task can shake nonsense off you. So I took the Fiskars shovel from the shed and moved out to Section C where a marker had sunk. The mud there has a memory and a sour smell. I levered the stone up a couple inches while the rain ticked on the shovel handle, and my breath made a chalky bloom in the air. Rafik called on the radio to say the steel trimmer was acting like it had a mind of its own in the shed, starting and choking when he hadn't pulled it. "The fuel are all clean. We don't keep the engines primed at night." He laughed the way you do when you want to hear a human voice bounce back from something you don't like. I told him to pull the spark plug and put it on the shelf. He said okay and went quiet for longer than I liked. On the way back, I walked the low path by the wall where the gaps in the iron fence let wind through as a tone. The names there repeat by accident of families. 2 Rebellos, 3 Cons, another Rebello. I had never noticed before how the final E in Rebello on one stone was etched at a different angle, like the hand that carved it had grown tired or unfamiliar mid-name. I took a picture with my phone and thought of my father's name, repeated exactly on the different pieces of paper that closed a life out. Near the caretaker's shed, I found a small brass key sitting on the windowsill. It had weight and the grooves were deep in an old cut pattern. I took it as a joke from Rafik because he knows I lose small things when I'm cold. He swore it wasn't his and that the only keys he carried were the ring for the outer gate and the shed padlock. The brass key didn't match either. It didn't fit any door in the watch house, not the gate, not the chapel vestry, not the bathroom near the outer road that we never open at night. I put it in my pocket and heard it bump the other keys when I walked, like an extra thought I wasn't ready to have. That same hour, the radio crackled through static and repeated one word between louder bursts. Down. It would hold a hiss and then shape that syllable as if a mouth were trying out a language. I checked my battery level. Full. The night after that, it repeated a different word. Wait. Always in the static, like somebody was trying not to press the talk button all the way. I logged it, and the logbook was the only place those words looked small. In the watch house, the heater ticked metal ticks, and the wet sleeves of my jacket stuck to my arms. By the third night, no one else wanted the route by the mausoleum. It was Rafik's laugh that changed first. He tapped the lighter and didn't spark it. "Tell me if you hear anything," he said, and wiped his hand on his pant leg, which I'd never seen him do. Mrs. D'Souza came at 7 with her square handwriting and asked why the gate chain had been replaced. I told her about the clipping. She held up her glasses to the window on her handkerchief and said she would call the city about the outer road lighting because 2 poles had blown. You can walk miles here and feel like you're standing in one place, because the fog stretches the view and compresses the steps the grave with the wrong date kept, reaching into my head like a tag that won't stop, scratching your neck. I went back to Section B where Mrs. Bono's stone stood and touched the numbers with my thumb. They were cold in a way that ate through glove wool. The damp soil around the stone was darker than the rest of the plot, as if it had been turned over a little and pressed back like bread dough. The weather that day had not been wet until after midnight. I know because I logged the first drop against the watch house window each night. I told myself there had been a broken sprinkler run by the church next door sometime in the daytime, though we don't share equipment. On patrol, I passed the chapel door and the lantern went out again. I walked straight over, tightened the bulb, tested the wiring with the little sniff-it tool we use. Fine. When I stepped back and turned my head, I saw the bell rope twitch like a muscle flexing in a jaw. I held the rope again, and this time it felt cool, slack, dead rope. Out on the main path, a lamp broke into a stuttering flutter and steadied. The fog deepened to that gray that hides edges but leaves the black gaps under hedges like mouths. When you hear old stories about a place, they stack like very light objects in a corner. They're easy to ignore until a draft gets in. An old man named Imran had been here before me, and he left without formal notice after 30 years. The story was that he quit when he found the headstones moved an inch closer to the shed every dawn for a month. People laughed, like you laugh when someone spills tea on a carpet and apologizes to the carpet. But I understood how you could notice a thing like that when you walked the same loops, when you noted the same chipped corner of concrete with your toe in the dark. What got me the next night was the spare grave plot map rolled in the watch house drawer. I unrolled it to put a new paper on top, and saw my own notes in pencil on the margin. They were marks for a plot I hadn't measured yet, little arrows and a calculation. It's possible I drafted routine steps without thinking while we were hectic the day prior. People do that. But my pencil was still sharp to a fresh point when I looked down at it, and the wood didn't show the wear of those marks. Sometimes the mistake is not the thing itself, but the moment you know you cannot explain how it made it to where it is. On Thursday, 2 hours before dawn, a soft humming under the mausoleum steps came back stronger. The rain had turned to a fine needle that stitched my hood to my neck, and the fog had the shine of showroom glass. I set the maglite beam low because when you lift it into mist, you blind yourself. The sound felt nearer in my teeth, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I pressed the brass key in my pocket, a small weight, and the edges couldn't get warm. I walked the length of the mausoleum wall and counted the iron vents near the ground. 2 on the north, 1 on the east, none on the west because the ivy would block them. Kneeling, I put my fingers on the lower stone lip and felt a fine vibration like a washing machine 2 floors down. There is a drain pit under the steps where runoff collects before the city's line takes it. The pit is shallow with a grate we open when the leaves choke it. The brass key didn't fit that grate, and it didn't fit the service closet on the side. I tested it anyway in the habit of trying to make an object become the solution you need. The radio spat a one-word hiss that I couldn't pretend was a glitch. Down! Then, after a hiss that made me pull the speaker away from my ear, wait. I breathed a hard white shape that tore itself and watched it vanish. Rafik replied from the caretaker's shed, voice small with the compression. Copy. His lighter tapped in the background. Little resinous clicks sent vibrating through a coil and a wire and air, and the sound curled in my head too long. I told myself that if there was a problem under the steps, I should treat it as a maintenance issue. That is the trick with fear. You dress it in a uniform and give it a tool bucket. I walked back to the shed for the small socket set and the pry bar. The steel trimmer sat quiet now with its pull cord looped in a new knot that neither of us tie. Rafik didn't look up when I came in. He stared at the spot on the floor like his eyes were on a page. I said I needed him to stand watch at the top of the steps while I checked the pit, in case I slipped. He nodded and came out into the rain without his jacket, then realized and went back. When he rejoined me, he smelled like tobacco even though we don't smoke on property. Something clung to his coat from years ago. The pit cover is a square grate with 4 screws that rust faster than anything else in this place. I knelt and the wet worked through my pants. The sound was fixed in the stone now, and as I put socket to screw, the humming rose like a refrigerator cycling on. We work in the kind of silence that has the texture of water in a bucket, plinking at new levels as it settles. I told Rafik to stand back a little. He said okay, and then, as if thinking someone else had asked him something, I'm here. 1 screw freed, then the second with that wet ache of metal giving. The third stuck so hard the socket slipped and my knuckles scraped the grate, and the pain felt clean, a reminder. I did what you always do and turned the wrench inward like I could make the rust feel me. The drizzle ticked the brim of my cap, and the sodium lamp behind us flickered twice in a rhythm that didn't match the weather. The 4th screw was a decoy, spinning loose without catching threads. Under the grate, the dark clicked inside like something adjusting slowly to company. I lifted the grate inches and propped it with the pry bar. Water had pooled there, a shallow silver that reflected the lamp in a foamy smear. A piece of cloth floated, pale like a lost rag. The humming didn't come from water. It came from the stone itself, through the steps as if the material's memory were playing noise to itself. Hear that, I said. Rafik didn't answer. I looked up and he had one hand on the bell rope line that runs just under the sod to the chapel, feeling it as if for pulse. It's vibrating, he said, and blinked hard like a man trying to push dryness into his eyes. I put my fingers to the same line near the ground, and felt a transparent shiver like when a truck idles a block away. The practical thing would have been to call the city line for utilities. Say we had a possible leak of something with a motor. I should have stuck the grate back down and written a neat line for the day to follow. But certain places make you want to complete the action you already started because the night doesn't owe you a do-over. The brass key came to hand without me thinking. I held it up, the drizzle polishing it brighter, and for a second it belonged to the moment the way a last piece of a lock set belongs. I pushed it into the smallest hole in the grate frame because that is the shape it seemed to want. It slid in with a satisfaction that felt engineered. The humming sharpened by a degree like a whisper stepping closer. Stop, Rafik said, not loud, and the radio hissed down, like it was answering him. I pulled the brass key out and the humming softened to where it had been. In the shallow water, the rag turned and showed a printed word, cut in half by a fold. I couldn't make it out and didn't like that I wanted to. They tell you metal has a voice when you work with it long enough. The pry bar levered, the grate rose higher, and the smell that came up was not rot or gas but cold metal, like the inside of unused pipe. Rain stitched itself into the pool and unstitched. Underneath, the step cavity was larger than I had realized, a depression lined with tight brick that must have been laid when the mausoleum was built. On the far side, where I expected earth, there was a smooth panel the color of damp bone. It might have been reinforced concrete. At the base of that panel, a tiny hatch or plug sat, not the cemetery's hardware. The brass key in my palm had a shoulder that matched that plug. The radio repeated a word I didn't know I feared until I heard it again. Wait. It didn't have a voice you could name a person with. It was just the residue of words stripped to shape by interference. We have rules about unauthorized spaces and structures, and I know them. I also know what it felt like to stand above something calling itself a routine. I chose to be boring. I put the key in my pocket, lowered the grate back as far as I could, and told Rafik I was done for now. He nodded, then looked at my hands as if counting my fingers. The bell rope at the chapel door was moving again when we passed, a tight, neat swing, and neither of us touched it this time. We wrote a report for the morning with the middle cut out of it. I left out that I thought the key fit something it shouldn't. The rain deepened to a steady line behind everything and then thinned near dawn. My jacket had gone from wet to a stiff kind of dry, and my radio battery dropped for the first time all night. We made coffee out of habit, both of us standing in a space that didn't hold heat. I watched the subtotal of hours left until daylight, the way you watch the last minutes of a test when you know you can't fix the missing problems. When the first smear of daylight rose over the wall, I felt something I knew was false relief, and I let it happen. We did a slow walk through, checking gates, lights, the water sit in the pit. The humming dipped like a thought being put away. In early light, small mistakes show themselves differently. The headstones at the corner near the shed looked wrong. Not a lot. A line that had been true ran off by a small degree. Rafik, who never notices layout unless asked, stopped and frowned. He used his boot to move a gravel line back against the concrete. "Someone's been at the bases," he said, like it was a human mess he could be angry at. I saw the same inch that the old story said, added not outward but inward, a late correction in a rough draft, as if the cemetery were pulling toward itself. We signed the book at the end of shift, and it was almost funny because my entry for that morning was already there, written in my square hand, the way I write when I'm thinking too hard about writing neatly. It included the line about the grate and the humming, and that I had not opened the hatch. The timestamp was 0112, which is when I was still at the outer gate relocking a chain that seemed never to have been cut. My name looked like mine in every way except that the cross on the T was longer. Rafik held the page at a distance like you do when you need glasses and don't have them. He didn't make a joke then either. I told myself to hand the brass key to Mrs. D'Souza and say it didn't belong to us. In the daylight, her reasons have weight I can put my hands under. She arrived with the armor of a coffee and a paper cup, and her glasses already smudged. She nodded through my report and said we'd have the city out for inspection on Monday. She wiped her glasses twice and then told me to go home and sleep. The ride out to the outer road is 40 yards of crushed stone that sounds like rain under tires even when it is dry. I went as far as the gate and realized my right pocket didn't hold the weight it should. I patted everything. The brass key wasn't where I'd put it. It is a small thing to misplace, except that I had to know what box it fell in and what mud it fell into. I retraced steps along the path by the mausoleum, in light that made the stones into ordinary stones again. I told myself the story would end here, with day filing the night into a folder. The grate over the pit was back in place with all 4 screws seated firmly, even the one whose threads were destroyed. Each screw head shone with clean cross slots. My hands had new scratches and the screwdriver sat on the shelf with a dry handle. I leaned my weight on the top step and it was warmer than the air. My breath made shapes that didn't leave like they should. The chapel door lantern burned a steady, flat glow. The bell rope hung motionless and dripped clear water in 2 regular drops. I told myself the sound had been water in the drain, and the radio words a neighbor's handset across the road bouncing into our frequency. The brass key could have fallen in the watch house on the ledger ledge beside the pencil sharpener. I walked there and it lay on the blotter exactly centered, polished as if it had been rubbed dry. My earlier signature was under it, the one timed before I'd made it. I lifted the key and it was cold in a way that didn't change under my palm. Through the window, the day looked like day anywhere. I turned to go, and from the open watch house door across the gravel, a line of sight points perfectly at the mausoleum steps. When the fog lifts, you can see that detail, how the place was designed around a straight look. The wind was low and steady and carried the metal smell of rain that had chosen not to fall. The hum arrived clear by itself as if the other sounds had moved aside to let it in, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker.